live on Long Island, New York. When I was a kid, our block used to throw a yearly block party. I had a few friends on the block that were in my grade, Mike and Danny. We would always hang out together at these block parties. My neighbors would go all out. There would be tables of baked goods, catered food. Some neighbors even had tables of alcohol out. Of course, we were like 13. No one was going to let us drink at that age. It was a Saturday, and people were setting up for the block party early in the day. The street was already closed off. It didn't really pick up until around 3. The 3 of us invited some other friends to come, and most of the day we were just messing around on the blow-up attractions or just eating people's baked goods. Eventually, some of our other friends left, and it got dark, but the party wouldn't end until late at night. Danny and I started joking about how I could beat him at MLB, and while Mike and one of our other friends named Steve were somewhere else on the block, Danny and I decided to take a break from the block party and play each other in MLB. About an hour later, we went back outside to look for Mike and Steve. We ran into Steve, who said Mike went into his house like forever ago and didn't come out. So we walked through the block party down to Mike's house and saw his parents, who told us he went inside. We saw his bedroom light was on and he was standing at his window. We started waving at him to come down. It didn't seem like he even noticed us though. Screaming over the blasting music would be kind of useless, so instead I said let's just go inside his house. We walked over to the stoop and tried the door, but it was locked. So we went around back to try the back door. This one was actually unlocked, so we let ourselves in to find Mike and tell him to come back outside. Naturally, we went right up the stairs towards his room. His door was cracked open, and naturally I went to push it open, expecting him to be in there. Instead, there was this tall man standing by the window looking outside, his hands resting on the windowsill. I backed up away from the door, frightened, but more so confused. I knew Mike's family, and I had no idea who this guy was. I backed away from the door and signaled for the other 2 to be quiet. I told them to go downstairs in as quiet a voice as I could. We didn't know if that was one of Mike's relatives or not, but either way, it was rude of us to barge into Mike's house like that, and we didn't want any relatives we didn't know to catch us. We left and went outside back to Mike's parents to ask who the man inside at the window was. They looked up at the window of their son's bedroom, and Mike's mom let out a short scream, followed by his dad running towards the house to unlock the front door. We watched as the man standing at the window turned and disappeared, as we stood there waiting in anticipation. A crowd started to form, and it became a scene as people were asking what was going on. 5 minutes later, Mike and his dad came outside to the crowd. He had already called the cops. Mike was apparently hiding in his closet after he saw a random man from his room walking up the stairs. The block party was shut down early, and the cops pulled up briefly. They searched the house with Mike's dad, but couldn't find a man anywhere. I remember going home that night scared shitless, and I could only imagine at the time how scared Mike must have been. I woke up in the middle of the night and my mouth was really dry, so I went downstairs to get some ice water. As I shut the fridge, I noticed something through the curtain in the kitchen. There's a light on the side of the house above the kitchen window that stays on all night, and it was exposing some shadow that wasn't usually there, shaped like a person. I knew better than to lift that curtain. I went straight to my parents' room and woke my dad up, who heard about the event that took place earlier down the street. He came down to look, but when we got to the kitchen, the shadow outside the window was gone, which confirmed it was a person. My dad went outside to run around the property real quick, finding no one. I don't know if he fully took me seriously and believed I saw a shadow, because for some reason he didn't want to call the cops. I like to think I'm pretty sure that was the same man outside the window that night. What were the chances there could be such a coincidence that same night? I slept with one eye open that night. Something very traumatizing happened to me when I was a very little kid. I was like 5 or 6. A nearby street was having a block party, which is basically just where a block is closed off to traffic and all of the neighbors on the street chip in for food and activities. My older brother, who was like 11 or 12, took me with him to this block party. It was a weekend, so our parents were a little more lenient with the curfew. My brother apparently had some friends on this block, and he met up with them, with me following behind him. I remember him introducing me to some of his friends, but I was a really shy kid, so I didn't really say much to them. Most of the night was a blur because it was just so long ago, but somehow I got separated from my brother. At such a young age, I remember panicking that I was lost. I was looking around everywhere for my brother. Eventually, I bumped into some tall old man, and he knelt down and asked me something along the lines of where was my family. Then he said he didn't recognize me from the street. I told him I was there with my brother, but I lost him. He started acting all concerned and told me to come with him to his house so he could call my parents. I was naive and I followed him, ignoring the words of any parents, "Don't talk to strangers." He led me through the crowd as I held his hand, and we got to his house. Once inside, he looked at me and smiled, and asked if I wanted any snacks. I nodded my head shyly. He went to his pantry and grabbed a bag of chips. Then he told me to follow him upstairs. He led me to a small bedroom upstairs and told me to sit on the bed as he pulled up a chair in front of me and just sat down. He told me to eat the chips, but I didn't. I nervously asked him to call my parents, and I believe he said he would in a moment. I honestly can't remember whatever creepy stuff he may have said, but he eventually made his way off the chair and onto the bed next to me, making no signs of trying to make the phone call to my parents. He put his arm around my shoulders, and that's when the doorbell rang, and it was the most relieving sound I could have imagined. He looked at me and told me to wait there. Of course, when the old man got downstairs and opened the front door, I ran downstairs seeking the aid of whoever was at the door, and it happened to be my brother, his friends, and a couple adults. My brother was told by someone that I was seen entering the old man's house earlier. My brother and the adults questioned the old man and I, mostly asking me why he brought me into his house. I gave my best 6-year-old detailed description I could. It probably was enough for everyone to realize what might have been about to go down. One of the adults brought my brother and I to her house, where she called my parents and then the police. My mom and dad were over in a heartbeat, and the cops followed shortly. I asked my mom and dad before writing this what I said that got the cops to arrest the old man, and it was simply that I said the old man lied about calling my parents and started touching me. I didn't ask my parents anything else, because quite frankly, I don't like talking or thinking about it too much. I'm just grateful things worked out the way they did, because I'm sure they were about to go very south. My block had a block party in 2017. It was the first and only one ever to date. Our block sits right in front of a small section of woods, so woods connect my and some of my neighbors' yards. During the block party, some of us started getting bored because it was mostly catered to the younger kids of the block. But there was this one creepy, shady guy walking around the block. He had some big can-like thing in his hands, and he kept spouting gibberish to people. Eventually, he came up to my friends and I and started saying the most random shit that honestly wasn't even coherent. We just walked away, assuming he was on drugs. Pretty soon after, 5 of my neighbors and I were down to play a game of manhunt, with the field of play ranging from one house across the block party to the woods behind the houses across the street. I was on Jess and Kenny's team. We started in my backyard. The rule was we all had to hide in different places. So I told them I'd hide in the woods and try to sneak my way around the houses through the woods, and I suggested different hiding spots for them. I waited in the woods for a while, expecting to see someone from the other team enter my backyard. Eventually, one of them snuck into the yard, and that's when I thought it was safe to start migrating. As I moved along, I started noticing some paint-like marks on a bunch of trees. They appeared to be big red X's, and in that immediate area, just about every big tree had an X painted on it. I heard screaming from the yard in front of me, meaning someone from the other team was chasing Kenny, so I ducked down and held position for a few. As I was idle in that position, I started hearing footsteps deeper in the woods. Then I heard a spraying-like sound, but the noise stopped before I could even turn around. I realized there was someone standing over there, deeper in the woods. The lights from the nearby houses was just enough to see him. He was looking at me. Apparently he stopped what he was doing when he spotted me. He started walking over to me, and I realized when he got closer that it was that creepy, crazy seeming dude from earlier. Suddenly that can in his hand made sense. When he was like 10 feet away, he started speaking. He kept saying X marks the spot, X marks the spot. I told him to fuck off as I turned and ran back to my backyard. No one was back there anymore, so I ran to find my friends in the block party and told them the game was off and explained what I just witnessed. So all 6 of us together marched back to the woods behind my backyard, and we started looking for him. He was nowhere to be found, but I did show my friends all the red X's he sprayed on the trees. I showed it to my dad later in the night when the block party was over. He told me there's nothing we could really do about it, and to just get a good night's rest. That night I had a bad dream. It was about that creepy man from the woods. In this dream, he would just keep chasing me through the woods as I heard his creepy voice saying X marks the spot. Then I would hear him spraying his can of spray paint. And that's when I woke up, in my pitch black room. I looked at the clock and it was only like 1 or 2 in the morning. Then, on the other side of my window, right above my bed, there was someone talking. My whole body jumped. I looked out the window, and there was a big red X painted right in the center of it. And behind that was the crazy man with the can. Though muffled, I heard him saying X marks the spot over and over, and he stood there looking down at me in my bed. Then he started hitting my window with his elbow, clearly trying to break it. I ran to get my dad, who's a huge burly dude. He looked out my window and saw the nut job still hitting the glass, which had yet to crack surprisingly. My dad started yelling taunts at the man, like he better be ready for an ass beating. Then my dad ran out of the room for the front door. I think it worked in scaring that whack job off because he stopped what he was doing and ran away. When my dad got to my window, I pointed him in the right direction and he ran off down the block. He was gone for a while. He didn't come back for like 10 minutes. He couldn't find the guy, but judging by the size of that crazy man, I know my dad could have pummeled him to the ground, and I wish I saw it happen. The story doesn't end there, however. The reason I decided to tell this story now in 2019 is because just a few days ago, there was a big red X drawn on our front door, as well as a bunch of trees in the woods in our backyard. 2 nights ago, I even heard footsteps passing my bedroom window at some odd hour in the night. We don't have cameras, but my dad is thinking about installing some now. If anything else happens, I will update.
My wife Cheryl and I own a farm in Buckingham, Iowa, where we mainly grow corn. This was in August of 2018 on a slightly rainy night. Cheryl and I have both spent our entire lives in the farm life. It's really all we know. Of course, farm life in Iowa means lots of space and very few people. Our closest neighbors, George and Kenny, were each about half a mile away in opposite directions, also farmers. With not much else going on around here, it's easy to become friends with your neighbors. We often have George and Kenny and their wives over and vice versa. On this one otherwise normal weekend night, we had George and his wife over for drinks. We all got pretty drunk while playing board games. They left around 11. Luckily, it's a 30-second straight line of a drive home. We continued to drink some wine as we watched one of our favorite movies. We were starting to get tired. We were definitely feeling the effects of the wine. We were most likely just going to fall asleep on the couch cuddled up together when there was a knock at the front door. A knock at the door at this hour was unusual. In fact, it never happened before. But accompanied with the knocks, we thought we could hear a voice say something. I lowered the volume of the TV. We waited for it to happen again. Like 20 seconds later, another set of knocks at the door, followed by a muffled voice saying, "We need help." I was about to get up and open the door when Cheryl shook my arm, and I looked at her, and she made a face and shook her head no. I whispered, "I'm just going to ask who it is." She replied I shouldn't let them know we're home, but odds are they already knew we were home. I went over to the door and asked, "Who is it?" The voice on the other side said through the door, "Oh, thank God, can you open up? We're lost." I said, "Who's we?" The voice said back, "My wife and I." I replied, "Can your wife say something?" There was a silence for a few seconds. I followed it up with, "Did you hear me?" The same voice said back, "Yeah, but she's not next to me right now." This is where red flags started going off in my head, and I started to realize the voice sounded a little off, like a man trying to make his voice sound a little higher. I laughed and said, "George, is that you?" George is a big goof, and him being drunk, it wouldn't be unheard of for him to do something like this. The voice said back, "Yeah," in a slightly deeper voice now. I almost felt relief, believing that it was actually George, but I didn't want to open the door just yet before confirming. Having someone knock on your door out here late at night claiming to be lost doesn't happen. It's not a thing, and it's an immediate cause for alarm. I said through the door, "Prove it, what's your wife's name?" A now unfamiliar voice said back, "That's a trick question." My smile disappeared. I went to get my phone and called George. Cheryl was watching the whole thing, telling me we should call the police. I said, "Hold on." The phone rang like 3 times before George picked up. Right away, I said, "Are you at my front door right now?" And he said, "No, why?" I told him there's someone at our front door trying to trick me into opening it. He said he'll hurry right over, and we hung up. Keep in mind, all of us were still drunk during this. There were knocks again at the door. I yelled, "I have a shotgun waiting for you if you don't leave here now." The voice said back, "We're just trying to use a phone, that's all we need." Cheryl called 911, which out here, it takes an extremely long time for an officer to arrive on scene. We heard footsteps walking around our wooden deck that wraps around the house. A couple sets of footsteps, actually. They stopped at one of our windows, which had the blinds closed, and we heard one of them attempting to lift the window open. This caused Cheryl, who was still on the phone with 911, to scream, "Leave us alone." I followed suit and screamed at the top of my lungs to get the fuck out of here or I'll shoot you. It took me that long to think to run upstairs to grab my shotgun from the closet. Literally a few seconds later, there were more pounds at the door, and this time it was actually George's voice yelling, "Open up." I let George in, who also brought his shotgun. He said he didn't see anything or anyone as he pulled up. He stayed with us until a police officer came to the house. He did a quick little scan of the property with us, then left. We took heed of his advice in installing a camera in the front and back, surprisingly something we never thought of until this incident. Still gives me chills that all that was keeping out whoever was on our front deck that night was a wooden door. This story takes place at my grandparents' farm in the summer of 2018. I was alone one night since my grandparents were away. I was getting paid to watch the farm for a couple nights. On the last night, I was watching TV in the living room when I started to hear a strange noise coming from outside in the cornfield. At first, I shrugged it off because I figured it was most likely a deer. That was until I heard all the cows start mooing at the same time. Usually you would hear maybe one cow moo at a time, but when every single cow starts mooing, then something is wrong. Something or someone would have to startle them to make all the cows freak out like that. I was the only one at the farm, so it was of course my job to see what was going on. So I went to the closet to get a coat on and go outside, but just as I was about to go outside, I heard a very high-pitched cow scream. I stood still for a while, shaking in my boots. Something terribly wrong was going on with the cows. I quickly ran upstairs to my grandpa's room. Under his bed, he always keeps a few guns. I loaded his hunting rifle and went outside. The cows still would not stop mooing, so I went into the barn to check. There was nothing out of the ordinary. All the cows were still here. That was until I walked further down and noticed that one cow was missing from his stall. It didn't make sense. I was sure he was tied up to the stall the last time I saw him. Then I thought I could hear a cow make a high-pitched moo sound from the cornfield outside the barn. So I went outside, but while I was walking to the field, I swear I heard what sounded like people talking. I finally had enough of this. I fired 2 rounds into the air. Everything went silent. The cows were quiet, and I couldn't hear anything from the field. That was until I heard the footsteps in the field. I didn't know if I had the balls to go inside the cornfield, but I had to do it anyway. This is the exact reason farmers have guns, and I couldn't just hide inside the house with trespassers in the field. I started to walk into the crops, and I could hear many pairs of footsteps all beside me. I was getting even more freaked out as I continued to walk deeper into the field, and then I froze. Down one of the rows of corn, there was a person in all black standing a few feet away from me. I rose my gun up, telling him to get out of my field. I wasn't bluffing, I was ready to shoot, but he never moved. So I fired another round into the air to scare him off, but he still didn't move an inch. Then he actually started walking towards me with his arms slightly out, as if telling me to lower my weapon. I aimed my gun at him again, screaming at him to go away. And that's when I made the horrible realization that I was surrounded by people dressed in dark clothing, like at least 6 or 7 other people. That was only the people I could see, who knows if there were more. And as the one guy got closer, I realized something. He, along with the rest, were all wearing these creepy masks. The man stopped approaching me as I started stepping backwards. They all stood in silence for a moment. I cannot explain the fear that I was experiencing. I thought I was about to be killed. That was when they all started chanting something. I couldn't understand it. It sounded like a different language, but the chants almost sounded like a song, and I started wondering if they were about to perform some kind of sick ritual on me. That was when I took the opportunity to run as fast as I could down a few rows of corn. When I was out of breath, I stopped and fired about 6 rounds in their direction. I heard a bunch of footsteps and rustling crops going in the opposite direction. I finally scared them off. I ran back towards the direction of the farmhouse and stopped. I saw something on the ground, and what I saw has stuck with me, scarred me. There was a cow head sitting in the middle of a circle of candles. I wanted to yak, and as soon as I got back to the farmhouse, I did. I grabbed the house phone and called the police. I told the operator everything to the best of my ability. She said that an officer would be there soon. After I got off the phone with the police, I called my parents explaining the situation and asked them to come pick me up. My dad said he'd be there in an hour. I sat upstairs in my grandpa's room, shaking and crying at the same time, waiting for what felt like an eternity, until I finally heard a police car outside. I ran outside to the officer and never felt happier in my life. I told everything to the officer. He searched the barn and then a little bit of the cornfield, and he found the cow head. He called up a search team after that, as this was now an active crime scene. When my parents arrived, I, along with the first officer, had a talk with them about everything that happened. Thankfully, my parents took me home after that. My grandparents took this very seriously, of course, and installed a high-tech security camera system all over the farm. Who knows what kind of group that was, but clearly they were doing some kind of animal sacrifice ritual or something. I just happened to be the unlucky one home alone on the farm they chose to do it at. My name is Howard. I'm 25 years old, and I live on my family's farm. I help take care of it when my parents are out of town. It's just a little family farm, not a commercial farm or anything like that. My parents want me to take it over when they're too old to take care of it anymore, as I'm the oldest of 3 and the only son. But honestly, I don't really want to. I don't see myself staying in the middle of Arkansas my whole life, and especially not after something really weird that happened only last July. My parents were on a romantic trip for a week, and so it was my 2 sisters, Crystal and Morgan, and I taking care of the property while they were gone. There's not much around here, lots of privacy and such, a little too much in my opinion. Except for this one night. It started later on in the night, as it was approaching time to go to bed. My sisters do college online. Crystal takes summer courses, and so she was in her room on her laptop doing work. Morgan and I were just hanging out watching some dumb show in the living room. All 3 of us kind of want to get out of the farm lifestyle. Me especially, since I'm oldest and in the prime of my 20s. One dreaded part of farm life is the predators, though. Not just the animals that come and eat your produce, but the people that come and steal from you. Believe it or not, it happens. It hasn't happened many times to us, but it does happen. We have a few guns in the house for this exact reason. Our 2 dogs outside suddenly started going crazy in the backyard. Something spooked them for sure. I first thing went outside to the yard to see what they were barking at. They both were looking in the direction of the crops, going crazy. I yelled at them to shut up, and they went quiet. I I stepped right in front of the crops and listened. I heard a whistling from inside of the cornfield. It was undoubtedly a human's whistling. This was the first time I was experiencing a trespasser on the property with my dad not here. I had to hurry inside to get one of the guns. The dogs started barking again. I told my sisters that someone's outside in the cornfield and I had to go chase them away. They both said that was a terrible idea to go run into the cornfield in the dark, and they knocked some sense into me when I realized they were right. I also realized how downright terrifying that would be. So instead, I went out back to the dogs once more going crazy, barking in the direction of the crops. I aimed the gun into the air and fired off a shot which echoed into the night, silencing the dogs. I also was on some kind of power trip in the moment and screamed out to get off our land as loud as I could. I felt that would have done the trick and went back inside. My sisters were both laughing, which caused me to laugh too, but our little laugh amongst each other didn't last long, because the dogs started going crazy again, even crazier this time. I went back outside, ready to do the same thing again, but I felt my heart skip a beat when I saw the guy standing about 20 feet from the dogs, right in front of the cornfield. He looked at me and I screamed, "Hey," at which point he ran into the cornfield. I started running over and fired another shot into the air. I stopped by the dogs. There was no chance in hell I was going in there. I wasn't about to leave the dogs out here either. I unclamped their chains from the hooks and brought them inside the house. I told my sister someone was sneaking around in the cornfield. So what did we do? We called our dad. He told me I had to be the man of the house and protect my sisters. He recommended I fire another warning shot outside if whoever it was came back. After this, we all just gradually went to our respective rooms. My sisters each brought one of the dogs in their rooms and I brought the gun in my room, just because we were all a little spooked by this. I had the window open, and as I was laying in bed watching a movie on my laptop, I heard a whistling from outside. I hurried to the window and looked out to see someone slowly walking in the grass. Then, like he had some sixth sense, he stopped walking and turned to look at my window, still whistling. This jerk was obviously trying to mess with us and scare us. A very stupid idea when I already made it clear I had a gun. I ran to grab the gun off the bed and aimed it out the window. I shot at the grass a few feet away from him, purposely missing, of course. This cut his little horror movie act short, and he ran out of view of my window towards the front of the house. This time he didn't come back. He'd have to be a fool to come back after that. I obviously told my sisters why I shot, and I assured them he would not be coming back. We never found out who it was or why. It could have been some teen or multiple teens just trying to scare some innocent farmers for fun, or it could have been an actually dangerous person.
Remember Chuck E. Cheese? That old arcade with the singing animatronics? Of course you do. I just found out they went bankrupt recently. It made me think back to my horrible experience there as a very little kid. I was no older than 8 or 9. It was like my third and last time ever at a Chuck E. Cheese. This specific location closed down years ago, but it used to be basically down the street from our old house. My mom took my little brother and I, and she let us roam free and do our own thing and play the games, while she sat at one of the tables reading like most of the other parents. I was playing this clown game where you had to shoot the clown's teeth out with this little cannonball shooter. I was playing the games that would get me the most tickets for the prizes. I finished the game again, and the ticket shot out from the ticket slot. That's when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned and jumped in my seat. I was greeted with a giant Chuck E. Cheese mascot in my face. He held out his hand for a high five, and naturally I gave him his high five with a smile. He then pointed at the tickets and gave me a thumbs up. I think I just continued laughing and smiling and said yeah. Then he pointed at the tickets once more and motioned for me to follow him. So I ripped the tickets from the slot and followed the giant mascot. As we walked across the main floor, a couple other kids around like 6 came up to him saying, "Hey Chucky," and he gave them both high fives. I kept following him,
wondering if he'd tell the other kids to follow, but he didn't. He would turn back every few seconds to make sure I was still following. Finally, we made it across the main floor by the stage towards this back area, where he waved me to follow him through this employees-only door. From what I remember about how I was feeling, let's just say a combination of weird and excited. We entered this narrow hallway, and I felt kind of special for being allowed access back here. Keep in mind, I had the mind and maturity of a very young child. The mascot led me to this back room where he motioned for me to enter first, so I did. It was this small changing room type of room. It had a few lockers on one wall and one long bench extending half the length of the room. That was it. He entered the room and shut the door behind us, and I noticed he locked it. That's when I became confused and afraid. I thought he was taking me to get a bunch of free tickets. What could he possibly do in this empty room with me? He approached me, put his furry mascot hand on my shoulder, and then started rubbing from my shoulder to my arm. Then he seemed as though he tried to reach lower with both of his hands, and I pushed him off and yelled, "Stop." That's when the person in the suit lifted the mask off his head, revealing some sweaty, middle-aged man underneath. He started to remove the rest of the costume from himself as he told me to be quiet. I sat there watching, shaking, and plotting my way for the door. When I thought he was distracted enough by the suit, I tried to run past him for the door, but he grabbed me and told me to stop. He offered me all the free tickets I wanted if I just behaved. I started to yell and pound on the door. He tried to cover my mouth, but I think he gave up when he realized it wasn't worth the risk for him. I unlocked the door and ran back down the hall in tears. I ran back to my mom, yelling at her about what just happened. She was distraught and went right to the front desk. The girl at the front desk seemed to be in a panic as well, and I think she called for her supervisor. Pretty soon, all the music was stopped and the place was put into a lockdown of sorts, where all the kids were to go to their parents. A bunch of workers ran to the back section, and eventually police showed up outside. I had to give my whole story to a crowd of like 6 people, and I was extremely nervous. The man in the Chucky suit was some random creep who snuck into the back section of the building to dress in one of the suits and apparently lure children to the back. Realizing and looking back at that now as a grown adult is disturbing and disgusting, that I was the victim of a predator. I never found out if that monster was caught. I used to work for Chuck E. Cheese very briefly when I was 21 years old. I was one of the janitors/maintenance workers. I know, not very awe-inspiring. I was broke as hell and needed money. All my job really entailed was cleaning tables and keeping the play areas generally clean. Sounds easy, but there was never really a time to just sit and take a breath. There was always something to clean or take care of. I would also be in charge of turning on and off the animatronics, opening the stage curtains, fixing busted arcade machines, and things of that nature. My shifts would always be later, from like 4 to 10 p.m. My location closed at 8 on weekdays and 9 on weekends. I would stay an hour, sometimes 2 hours after, to get the place in top shape ready for the next day. So this one night, I was working past close like I usually did. Everyone had already left the building, including the other workers, so I was the last one in the building. I was dragging my cleaning cart around the arcade area. I had already turned off all the game machines. I was by that space-themed arcade machine where you had to press the button at the right moment to stop the light on the jackpot bulb. As I was passing by this machine, the space-themed music suddenly emits from the machine at a very loud volume, and all the lights start flashing again. I felt like my heart was in my throat, that's how much it startled me. I fiddled with my keys to access the control port of the machine to turn it off again. I'd never seen anything like that happen before. It suddenly just freaked me out. Only because I was all alone in that big building pretty late at night. The weirdness didn't stop there though. By this point in the night, I had already shut down the animatronics on the stage, so when I heard Chucky's pre-recorded laugh break the silence of the room, my heart started pounding again. The laugh was short and cut off. It almost sounded glitchy. I ditched my cleaning cart to go backstage and check on the animatronics, and I could see they were in their idle modes now, meaning they would move their limbs and heads around every so often.
I would have to go to the control room to turn them off, but this was the second strange thing to happen that night. I started getting paranoid that someone else was in the building with me, but that thought was interrupted when I noticed that the Chucky animatronic was facing me and its head angled down perfectly to look as though it was looking at me. It was bizarre. Bizarre that I was finding it that disturbing. I'm not crazy, but for my own peace of mind, with my eyes on the Chucky animatronic, I walked past it, closer to the control room. I waited there for a few seconds, and then the animatronic spun 90 degrees to face me once more, perfectly. I swear it was once again looking right at me, and then the laughter emitted once again from the animatronic. But in a creepy, glitchy, cut-off manner, this time much louder, obviously because I was right next to it. I ran to the control room to hit the switch to turn everything off on the stage once more. I left the control room, and the Chucky animatronic was still facing the direction it was moments before. I left the stage through the curtain and just felt uneasy. I was starting to think maybe it was all just getting to my head. But that's when I heard the horrible laugh again come from the stage behind the curtains. That was the last straw. I took my card, clocked out, and left. I texted my boss the next day that I had to leave early because I was feeling extremely sick. He said it wasn't a problem, but he never mentioned anything about the animatronics being left on. And when I asked him if the animatronics had some kind of motion detecting feature to look at people, he said no, they didn't. I'm not the most superstitious guy, but I firmly believe I wasn't the only presence in that building that night. And I don't mean there was another person in there. This is a story from my childhood that I don't like to look back on too much. I was 13. My mom brought my two little sisters and I to Chuck E. Cheese one evening. My sisters are 4 and 6 years younger than me, so it was more for them, and my mom just wanted me to come along. My mom was playing games with my sisters, so I went to do my own thing. It was my only time ever at Chuck E. Cheese, so I was trying to play every game at least once. Eventually, a worker in a red polo shirt came up to me. He was in his lower to mid-20s, I'd say. He didn't seem that old. He asked me if I wanted some more tokens. I said, yeah, sure. He told me to follow him. He led me through this sketchy back door, which led to a back exit. I asked him where he was leading me. He said to his truck. He told me not to tell anyone, but that he had access to all the tokens he wanted and just kept piles of them in his car. I stopped following when I realized he was leading me to his car. I told him my mom would be mad. He tried to push that I follow him a little more, but gave up. Before I walked back inside, he asked for my AIM username, and I gave it to him, always excited for new friends on AIM. For those of you who don't know, AIM was an instant messenger that was all the rage before smartphones and texting really became a thing. I don't remember his username, all I know it was something with his name in it, which was Ben. I would sign on to AIM every single night, including that night after Chuck E. Cheese. I signed in, and I had a few friends online. Next thing I knew, I got a message from Ben, so I added him to my buddy list. He said, hey, it's Ben from earlier. I replied, what's up, and we started chatting. He chatted with me as if we were good friends already. I asked him how he was able to get all the tokens he wanted, and he said it's easy when you work there. He told me he was going to come to my house that night with a bunch of tokens. I told him, no, it's okay, and he told me, no, it's fine, you live really close to me anyway. I replied, how do you know where I live? And he said he followed my mom's van on our way home. I blocked his account immediately. I was beyond scared. I told my friends about it on AIM. Some of them said I should tell my parents or call the police. But I waited. Maybe he was bluffing. But no, he wasn't. I heard a truck pull up outside through my open window. I looked out the window and saw the black truck that Ben guy was leading me towards earlier. I saw him get out from the truck, and I know he spotted me because he started walking over to my window. I pulled the window in and locked it, and then shut the blind. By that point, he was already halfway to my window, and he was waving his arms at me. I ran to my mom to tell her. She didn't find it funny, thinking I was kidding at first, but I convinced her after she looked out the window and saw the black truck begin to speed down the road. My mom wanted me to show her the AIM conversation, but I couldn't, as I had deleted him off my buddy list and blocked him. My parents called the police, of course, but that was just for peace of mind. They couldn't do anything besides make a report. The next day, my mom called the Chuck E. Cheese and asked about a Ben. They said they had no Bens who worked there. There were also no employees matching that guy's description. The Chuck E. Cheese eventually handed the CCTV footage from the day before to the police department for an investigation, which turned up no results. My family never went to a Chuck E. Cheese ever again.
Hopefully I don't dox myself by writing this, but I'm a graffiti artist, or as some might see it, a delinquent. I'm fine with either title. Point is, I like to spray paint, and I'm decent with a can in my hand. The tagging community is atrocious. People aren't friendly, and there's no respect between artists. Because of this, I've adopted a much more inconspicuous routine. I like tagging up quieter spots, where my art likely won't be seen by other artists or the general public. Old train lines are usually a good bet, since the train cars are endless and new trains get decommissioned and left to rot on them all the time. My friend Lucas likes to come with me when I tag up, even though he's not big into the whole thing himself. I welcome the company. Some people don't understand the importance of a good friend, and I think that's sad. Most of my other friends don't seem to respect my time or interests as much as he seems to. Lucas and I found ourselves smoking on some nameless set of old tracks I found earlier that day on Google Maps. I'm not a big stoner myself, but he smokes a lot of weed, so I often indulge to match his vibe. It wasn't that late, maybe a little past 10 p.m. We finished a J and talked as we walked alongside the old, rusty freight train. Oddly enough, there wasn't a single tag on the entire train. It must have been recently moved here, I thought, excited that I'd get first dibs on such a good surface. I tossed Lucas a can for him to mess around with, and I started doing my own thing. About 5 minutes later, I finished my first tag. I admired it for a bit before moving to the next car, then the next. About 15 minutes and 2 paint cans later, I had 3 decent tags up adjacent to one another, and I was pretty proud of myself for how they looked in combination with each other. Sorry in advance if this offends anyone, but I tend to discard my empty cans wherever they go dry. So I flung them back the way we had come, enjoying the satisfying clattering sound a ball bearing makes when bouncing around the inside of an empty can. I then caught up with Lucas, who had seemingly rolled and lit another joint, neglecting the paint I had given him. For context, the reason I'm not a big stoner is because I started getting unbearable anxiety highs much more frequently, maybe 90% of the time. In hindsight, smoking 2 J's with Lucas was a borderline detrimental decision. After all, we were doing something illegal, which was already pretty anxiety-inducing. I smoked the second joint anyway, confident that I'd be okay. As soon as the final sparks floated off the J, that's when we heard it. A muffled clang from somewhere behind us rang out into the night. The two of us froze and stared into the darkness. I could feel droplets of sweat forming around my neck as adrenaline began coursing through me. I couldn't tell if the sound had come from outside of the train or from inside one of the cars. It was hard to tell which option was worse. We waited for a full minute in silence, and nothing. That's when I whipped out my phone and recorded this video.
Bro, what the fuck was that? No way, bro. You fucking heard that? I heard that shit. What the fuck? Fuck!
As the video shows, whoever made that noise picked up one of my empty paint cans and threw it at us, before chasing and shouting at us. You can't really see the paint can in the video, but I swear to you, that's what the first sound was. As we frantically made our escape, whoever was behind us yelled, "You better not trip, boy." A few seconds later, an actual gunshot sounded off behind us, almost causing Lucas to trip and fall. It startled me so much that my finger slipped off the record button on Snapchat and the video cut out. We bolted down the tracks until they intersected a main road and didn't stop running until we were a safe distance away. I don't think I've ever been more terrified in my entire life. It didn't help that I was stoned out of my mind. My hands were literally shaking. So were Lucas's. We found our way back to the car and drove home in silence. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? I was literally breaking the law. That wasn't an option. The story doesn't end there, though. I actually went back to those tracks a few weeks later, but this time during the day and equipped with my trusty Glock 17. To my surprise, the train was still there. Despite that, there was a pretty glaring difference this time around. In the 3 spots where my tags had previously been were now ugly blotches of red paint. Someone had deliberately covered my work. Quietly, I kept investigating and eventually came to a train car with its door wide open. I took a look inside, and it was bizarre. The train car was completely empty, except for a chair in the direct center and what looked like ropes and chains scattered about. Some of the ropes were wrapped around the legs of the chair, and others were just lying on the floor. The weirdest part was the smell, though. The whole car smelled like bleach. If you closed your eyes, you would have guessed you were in a cleaning supply closet. I can't overstate the smell, though. It literally smelled like the whole train car had been doused in bleach. I went to take a picture of the scene when I thought I heard a metal clang somewhere further down the train. I could have imagined it, but I wasn't taking any chances. That was enough for me. I was out of there as quickly as I had come. I've told so many people this story, and none of them could rationalize that psycho's actions in a way that makes sense. I doubt a homeless person would be able to get their hands on a gun, but I can't fathom why someone other than a homeless person would respond so aggressively, and why they decided to cover up my tags is another mystery. I think the most disturbing aspect of this whole thing was the chair in the middle of the train car. I really want to go back to those tracks just to take a picture of what I saw, but I haven't worked up the courage to. I have no idea if whoever was there that night was really shooting to kill us or just trying to scare us. But sometimes, late at night, when it's just me and my thoughts, I can still hear that shot ringing in my ears. As I'm writing this, it's early July. This story took place at the beginning of summer. I usually try to hang around my college town or travel to Europe in the summer as a way to avoid going home, but that wasn't a possibility this time around. I found myself reluctantly returning home at the beginning of the summer. I just had to make it through 1 week, and then I'd be on a plane to Germany. I didn't really feel like seeing any of my old friends, but I wasn't too keen on staying home either. So I found myself waking up early and spending my entire days hiking, watching movies, or even just driving around aimlessly. It was my last day home. I was getting bored of the stuff I had been doing and wanted to do something a little more exciting. My friends and I used to train hop, one of the many unruly activities that I had since cut out of my life. I decided what the hell and drove to a secluded set of tracks I knew about. Freight trains always passed through here, so I knew there would be many options. The tracks were surrounded by trees and various flora, part of the reason I had chosen them. The last thing I needed was to be caught for doing an illegal activity after having been clean for so many years. I parked my car and made my way over to the tracks. Let me describe the layout so it's easy to understand. This specific set of tracks ran through the trees for a while before entering a tunnel. There was a very small clearing on the other side of the tunnel and then a massive bridge over the water. My friends and I used to ride the train all the way across the bridge, but since it was just me, I would have no way of getting back to my car unless I felt like walking 10 miles. So I decided that I'd hop on the train and take it through the tunnel, hop off, and get a peaceful walk back to my car. I walked along the tracks and waited for a train to pass. It was probably 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Finally, after about 10 minutes of walking, I started to feel the familiar vibration in the rails. I quickly ran to the side and tried my best to stay out of sight. Usually, as far as I know, freight train conductors didn't care enough to report people walking along the tracks, but I didn't want to take any chances. The train passed, and I waited for a good amount of cars to go by before emerging from my hiding spot. I picked a car that looked easily attainable and began jogging alongside the train like I had done 100 times before. Once I was confident enough, I grabbed hold of the ladder and swung myself up. It was pretty easy. The train wasn't traveling very quickly. As my part of the train was about to enter the tunnel, I saw a strange flash of light from up ahead. I assumed it was a spark from the train or something, but truth be told, I had never seen anything like it before. I hoped there wasn't an errant wire or something dangerous in the tunnel, but it was too late to hop off. The train started picking up speed since the tunnel was perfectly straight, and I closed my eyes as the adrenaline rush started coming on. Just then, I felt a hand reach out from the darkness and literally grab my leg. I lost my footing and nearly slipped, but my hands were firmly gripping the train. I screamed and kicked, but the train sped by before I could make contact with anything. Before I could even comprehend what just happened, I felt another hand slap against my leg. I screamed again before scrambling up the ladder, hopefully out of reach. My heart was racing. What the hell just happened? The train exited the tunnel, and I hopped off without thinking. I waited for the train to completely pass and watched it chug over the bridge. I remember pacing back and forth in the little clearing, thinking about what just happened. Like, were there really people in the tunnel, and what could they possibly be doing there? Why the hell would they try to drag me down? All of these thoughts and more were racing through my mind when a stark realization struck me in the face. The only way back to my car was through the tunnel. There was absolutely no chance in hell I was walking back through that tunnel with those people in there, especially since they'd be able to see my silhouette and I'd be walking through darkness. I sat on the ground for what felt like forever. There was no other option. I couldn't walk across the bridge without risking my life. A train could come along at any second and the bridge was too long. I considered calling someone to come rescue me, but I wasn't even sure if they'd be able to do anything. Police weren't an option. I was breaking the law just being here. I had no choice. I picked up a rock and started making my way through the tunnel. There were 2 people in there, which I knew for a fact, but there could have been more. I had no idea. I got about halfway to the point where I felt the second set of hands when I heard something. A faint clicking was coming from somewhere in the tunnel. It sounded like a human clicking their tongue, but it could have been made by a machine. It was honestly hard to tell. I froze and thought to myself, continuing to walk this tunnel was a death sentence. I felt a rush of confidence and pulled out my phone. "You better stay back or I'll shoot," I threatened, my words echoing off the tunnel walls. There was a moment of silence. The clicking stopped as quickly as it had begun. I was obviously bluffing about having a gun, but I figured it was better to bluff than just walk in silence. I then pulled up a video on YouTube of a gunshot sound effect, turned up my phone's volume, and played it. It was honestly louder than I was expecting, and with the echo of the tunnel, I prayed to God that whoever was in there bought it. Without waiting another second, I sprinted full speed into the darkness, bracing myself for a fight. I didn't stop running until I had reached the other side. By some miracle, no one tried to grab me. After making it out of the tunnel, I looked back. There was another flash from deep in the tunnel. This time, though, it subsided long enough for me to clearly see 2 silhouettes standing on the tracks facing me. That was it for me. I turned to leave, but as I was jogging away, the nastiest screech I've ever heard emanated from the tunnel. It sounded barbaric, definitely human, but far from normal. I don't plan on ever train hopping again. The New York City subway system is a scary place. I've been an MTA worker for 7 years, and nothing really surprises me anymore. When friends and family ask if I have any stories, though, there is one that stands out among the rest, one that I can't explain. This happened to me about 2 years into the job, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was pretty acclimated to everything at that point, and things had become routine. I was stationed in Brooklyn at the time, and I was doing some routine maintenance in High Street Station. There wasn't a soul on the platform. It was actually kind of eerie. You're used to these subway stations overflowing with people, so seeing them empty and almost deserted looking was a strange adjustment to make. I hadn't seen a person on the platform in hours, and it was dead silent except for the buzz of the lights and the occasional passing train. Out of nowhere, I heard a clang from somewhere down the track. It startled me so badly that I dropped my mop in shock. The sound wasn't something I was used to hearing. The best way I could describe it to you is that sound that a rock would make if it had been dropped on a metal rail. I stopped what I was doing and looked into the tunnel, listening for other noises. After a while, I concluded that whatever I heard had either been caused by an animal or a falling piece of cement. After all, these stations were pretty old. I went back to work, not thinking too much about the sound. About 10 minutes later, the same sound shook me from my concentration, only this time it was probably about twice as loud. This time, I actually became a little concerned, dare I say scared. Was it really possible that 2 chunks of the ceiling had fallen in the span of 10 minutes? I put down my supplies and walked over to the tunnel entrance, trying to be quiet. I peered into the darkness and couldn't really see anything. I debated whether or not it was a good idea to call out into the tunnel, and ultimately decided against it. I still figured it was nothing, but after the initial fear had worn off, I was more confused than anything. I kept trying to think of things that could make a sound like that, not once, but twice. It was especially bizarre since the second sound was louder. I tried to keep my mind off the sounds and went back to work, finding a good rhythm again. I was almost done with my work on this platform and was pleased that I'd get to leave this weird station soon. As I was wrapping things up, I heard something that gave me the chills. A child's voice called out for help from inside the tunnel, and he sounded like he was in distress. I instantly stopped what I was doing and made my way over to the edge of the platform. I hesitated for a few seconds before deciding that a child in anguish wasn't something my moral conscience would allow me to ignore. I walked down the steps leading onto the tracks and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I shouted into the tunnel, asking that kid if he was okay. No response. That's weird, I thought, starting to feel nervous about this encounter. Just then, the kid's voice rang out again, repeating his call for help. I yelled back, asking him if he could hear me. He responded yes, and I asked where specifically he was. There was a brief moment of silence before he just said, "In front of you. Just keep walking." I really didn't want to, but couldn't just leave some helpless kid all alone on those tracks. It was dangerous. I began walking forward when something dawned on me. I yelled into the darkness one more time, this time asking the kid what was wrong. An uncomfortable pause again before the kid responded, "Just keep walking." I didn't like that. This whole thing was off. My eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, and I was able to slightly make out what was in front of me. There actually was what looked like the shadow of a kid just up the tracks, but there was something else that almost made me scream in fear. Another shadow, this one much taller, obviously an adult. My blood ran cold, and I stopped in place. This wasn't happening to me. As slowly as I could, I turned around and made my way back to the platform. Luckily, I wasn't chased on the way back. The kid shouted, "Wait, where are you going?" once I reached the platform, but I wasn't sticking around another second. I made my way up the stairs and called the police as soon as I got cell service. I told them everything, and police were swarming the platform in a matter of minutes. I waited to see what they turned up. After about 20 minutes of searching, they did find something chilling. There was a single kid's shoe just lying in the tunnel, which the police hypothesized could have signified a struggle. After hours more of searching and scouring every available database for missing children, we were told we'd receive a call if anything ever came up. It was concluded that whoever had been down there, though, had hidden somewhere in the tunnels. I have no idea what to think of this experience. This is the best theory I can come up with. Some psycho kidnapped a child and forced him to yell for help in an attempt to lure some unsuspecting Good Samaritan into a trap. Or hell, maybe it's their own kid who they're raising to also be a psycho. I can't think of any other reasonable explanation besides this one, but if I'm right, I can only imagine what that kid must be going through. This happened back when I was 17, my last Halloween at home before going away to college. It was Halloween in our peaceful town where nothing bad ever happens. Our house is in the wealthier side of town, and while our house would be described as gorgeous by anyone not from the area, the real head turner is our next door neighbor's house. It sits on that line of being called just a huge house or a mansion. They always go crazy with their decorations for any holiday, specifically Halloween and Christmas. This one year was no exception. By October 1st, they already had all their crazy decorations out. Some houses go the cute and innocently spooky route, like with smiling ghosts and blow-up decorations. But our neighbors go the actual scary route, with the fake graves, fake bloody body bags, actually scary-looking fake corpses, etc. It actually draws a lot of attention. People know to drive by and take videos, so it's never uncommon to see cars just sitting in front of their house in the middle of the street from time to time. I'll rename my neighbors' names to Mike and Donna just to not blow up their spots even more. Fast forward to Halloween Day. It was luckily a Friday this year, so that meant parties and all that could be held on actual Halloween. My dog Bear sleeps downstairs in the corner of our dining room, and he woke me up really early morning, like 4 a.m. when it was still pitch black outside. He was barking at something outside. I yelled across the house to shut up, Bear, and my mom came out into the hall and did the same. Bear stopped barking after this, but I had no idea what he was barking at. I fell back asleep quickly after that, then woke up to my alarm like 2 hours later. So I started getting ready for school as my dad was leaving for work, and as he stepped out onto the front deck, he came back in and got mad at me and said, "Damn it, Zach, clean up the dog's shit." He thought I let our dog crap in the front of the house for some reason. I told him I definitely didn't though. He was in a hurry, so he left without more arguing. Next up, it was my turn to leave for school, and as I left the house, I got a whiff of something kind of unpleasant. I now knew what my dad was talking about. I didn't see any dog crap anywhere though. Later when I got home around 2, I still smelled that smell. I had no idea what it was, but it was really starting to stink. My parents were both at work, and my parents wanted me to hand out candy when trick-or-treaters started coming. It wasn't until around 4 to 5 that they started coming. When I opened the door to the first few trick-or-treaters, I'd get a whiff of that increasingly horrible stink, and the kids and their parents clearly smelt it too because they were all commenting on it. One parent told me it was even worse next door. I started to know whenever to expect the doorbell to ring because I'd hear groups of people pointing out how horrible it smelt. At one point, I saw Mike and Donna in front of their house, looking around. So I went outside and went over to ask them if they smelt that too, but that was hardly a question because it got worse on their property. It clearly was coming from the front of their property, but there wasn't any dog crap or anything. The smell was coming from one of the body bag decorations, only it apparently wasn't a decoration. The couple had a number of fake body bags leaned on things like the mailbox and their front tree, but there was one just laying flat on the ground, and Mike said to Donna that he didn't put that one there when she asked. The smell was unbearable from this bag. Mike ran to grab a knife and cut the bag open, and what we saw made me sick. He of course cut the top of the bag open, revealing the rotting face of an actual human corpse inside the bag. We all put our hands over our mouths in disgust, wanting to throw up. And of course, there was an audience of kids and parents to see what was going on. It became a huge scene. Mike called the cops, and their whole front yard literally became a crime scene with people gathering from all over to watch, even though the cops kept telling everyone to clear out. The body was taken away. I told the police that my dog Bear was barking last night at like 4 a.m., and he may have been barking at whoever dumped the body there. Mike told my dad a week later that the body turned out to be a local 30-something-year-old guy who had taken his own life. As for who dropped the body there or why, that's unclear. Mike and Donna are very likable people, so we all think it was somebody who just looked at them as some rich, snobby household that overdoes it with the decorations for attention. Obviously, there are some sick people out there. I'm a single 24-year-old female living alone in my grandma's house. The house was basically left to me after she passed away because my mom didn't want to sell it and she also doesn't want to move out of her house. So I get to stay in my grandma's house alone. This was last year Halloween, my first one living in the house alone. I considered just leaving a bowl of candies on the stoop, but I figured that was not the best way to associate a friendly face to the house that I was new to living in. The day went pretty normally. Halloween was on a Sunday, so the trick-or-treaters started coming early on in the day, and it continued all day. Some people asked if my grandma was home, sadly unaware that she had passed away. I explained to those people that I'm her granddaughter, and that I live here now. My grandma was a very loved lady, so it was no shock to me how many people asked about her that day. Mostly everyone who knocked on the door was very friendly and normal. Later on that night, past 9 o'clock, when the trick-or-treaters had dwindled down almost completely, I heard a voice outside the front door say trick-or-treat. No knocking or ringing the doorbell. I was in the kitchen, so I definitely would have heard any knocking, but it did seem possible that he thought he pressed the doorbell but didn't. When I went out to greet him, I saw it was this average-height guy in a purple suit and creepy plastic mask. I don't really know what the costume was supposed to be, but it was interesting, I guess. When I opened the door, he said trick-or-treat again, but the strange thing was I could tell the guy was a bit older, like a full-grown adult. He was changing his voice to be a little higher pitched, like he was trying to sound younger. It was strange. I assumed he may have had some issues, so whatever. I asked him what his costume was supposed to be, but he didn't answer. We just made eye contact through his mask. I took 2 pieces of candy and dropped it in his pillow sack he was holding, which looked completely empty. That was the part that weirded me out the most. He looked into the sack, then back at me. I said, "Have a good night," and closed the door. That was weird. He was the last trick-or-treater of the night. I wondered if he was accompanied by anybody watching over him, because I assumed he was special needs or something. He was clearly a 30-something-year-old man behind that mask. The rest of the candies I just left on the dining room table. Halloween was over. Or so I thought. The next night, around the same time as the previous night, I heard a loud trick-or-treat at the front door. That same creepy fake high-pitched voice. I had to have imagined it, I thought. But when I went to check through the peephole in the door, it was him again, in the same costume. And by the looks of it, he had an equally empty pillow sack as the night before. I didn't open the door, no shot in hell. A few minutes later, I heard him shout trick-or-treat again. I ignored it. In fact, I shut off the living room lights to basically say, "Hey, get off my stoop, I'm not answering the door." I went upstairs to my room and shut the door and started watching TV in there instead. Out of sight, out of mind. Until I heard a pop at my window. Something was thrown at it, like a rock. I muted the volume on the TV, and a few seconds later, I heard the familiar trick-or-treat. I suddenly was in panic mode. Why was he doing this? I went to the window, lifted it up, and looked down. That man in the purple suit and mask was looking up at me. I threatened him with calling the police. In response, he very slowly lifted his empty-looking pillow sack up and held it open. It seemed he was some asshole trying to scare me, but Halloween was over, and I wasn't amused. I called 911, and police showed up in under 10 minutes. The guy was still outside. He refused to talk to them, so they put him in handcuffs and took his mask off, and as I figured, he was some creepy-looking 30-something-year-old guy. They told me they were bringing him down to the station, but apparently they let him out within 48 hours, because 2 nights later, he came back to my house, this time at the backyard door. He never knocked or rang the bell. He'd just stand outside with his empty sack and costume, creepily yelling trick-or-treat. I called the police again and told them he's back, and once again the police came and arrested him. I swear to God, a week later the man had returned once again, throwing a rock at my window. This time when I called 911, he seemed to actually disappear before the police had gotten there. But regardless, it seemed the police didn't really care to do anything. Either that or they couldn't. Luckily, I think the man lost interest because he hasn't returned since then. At least as far as I know, unless he's been hiding in my bushes watching me, which is disturbing to imagine. Halloween is coming up, and I'm kind of nervous he's gonna come back. I was 10 years old in 5th grade. I was planning on going trick-or-treating with my friend Jordan. We already knew the route we were going to take. It was the first year that we were being allowed to trick-or-treat alone. My mom gave us big bags for candy. It was a weekend night, so we could luckily stay out later. We did some day trick-or-treating, and after about 2 hours, we went back to my house and took a break. My parents ordered Chinese food for dinner. Jordan stayed for dinner. Then around like 7 or 8, we went back out for some night trick-or-treating. My parents wanted us to stay close. We obviously said yes to that, but we kind of strayed off a different, further away route that we knew less kids would go down. Everything was going as normal. Less houses would open their doors after dark, we noticed though. But there was still some kids out trick-or-treating since it was the weekend. One house we got to, we rang the bell, and within like 10 seconds, as if he were waiting by the door, a man opened up. Looking back, he was a bald man, looked like he was 45, and had a small gap between his 2 front teeth that we noticed when he smiled as he opened the door. He was overly friendly from the start, complimenting our costumes, trying to ask us where we're from, and just being overly conversational. We just wanted candy. He eventually said he has the candy inside if we want to come in for a second, followed with he wanted to show us this cool Halloween decoration he had inside. He described it as some talking skeleton trapped in a cage begging to be let out. Jordan and I weren't comfortable going inside this man's house though, obviously. When we said that in not so many words, he said he understood, and asked if we wanted to come in real quick just to pick out the candies that we wanted. We said it's fine, he could just give us whatever. He tried to insist one more time, and we said no, and he said no worries, then went inside to grab us some random candies. They were these chewy candies wrapped in see-through wrappers. We thanked him and left. As we walked away from his front door, we noticed he didn't close the door. He just watched us as we left. We walked away from his house down the sidewalk, and after another glance back, we now noticed he was walking in front of his house slowly with his hands on his hips. We considered running away, but there were other people down the block, so nothing would happen most likely. We just skipped the next house and went to the house 2 doors down. A woman answered, and we told her about the creepy man 2 doors down. She said she didn't know him at all, but that we should tell our parents when we get home. We ran into these 2 kids going in the direction of the creepy man's house, and we stopped them and warned them not to go there, and their reaction said it all. They already went to his house too, and had the same exact thing happen to them. They looked to be our age as well. We asked what candy he gave them, and it turned out to be the same candies. They already threw theirs away, so we dug into our bags, found them, and threw them away as well. If anybody would be sus enough to lace candies, it would be a guy like that. We wondered what exactly that man was trying to do if we were to have actually entered his house. Like, was he actually just innocently trying to show us something, or did he have other intentions? Our question was answered the next day, because that man ended up on the news for attempting to lure kids into his house, claiming he had a new puppy. It seemed his story changed for different kids, possibly based on their ages. Thank God it sounded like everyone was smart enough to not enter the man's house.
I woke up at 7 a.m., just like every other workday. The alarm went off, and my hand automatically reached for the phone. I swiped up to unlock it, still feeling groggy, not quite ready to leave the warmth of my bed. Instead of getting up to check myself in the mirror, I opened my camera app, lazily trying to spot any new pimples. It was easier than walking over to the bathroom. As soon as the camera app opened, I noticed something unusual. In the bottom left corner of the screen, there was a video thumbnail that I didn't remember ever taking. My heart rate sped up a little, but I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe I had accidentally recorded something? I knew I hadn't used the camera in 3 days, and I distinctly remembered the last photo I'd taken. But I tapped the video, curious to see what it was. The moment it began to play, I felt like my world shifted. My hands tightened around the phone. It showed someone entering my room. This person walked quietly, as if they had all the time in the world, right up to my bed. The angle changed, and I saw myself lying there asleep, completely unaware. The person, no, the intruder, leaned over, the camera capturing my face. My chest rose and fell steadily as I slept, snoring lightly. The video ended with them standing back up and leaving the room as silently as they came. My stomach lurched. How could this have happened? Why didn't I wake up? I've never been a deep sleeper, and my apartment isn't large. Any noise, especially something that close to me, should have pulled me out of my sleep. But there I was, completely oblivious to what had happened. The first thing I did after watching the video was check the apartment. I moved quickly, my body tense, looking around every corner and behind every door. There was no sign of forced entry, no mess, nothing out of place. I started feeling foolish. I had forgotten to lock the door when I got home last night. That was it. I must have left it open, making it easy for someone to walk right in. The thought made me feel even worse. Who would do something like this? Someone had walked into my home, into my most private space, stood next to me while I slept, and recorded it. They didn't take anything, nothing was missing. They just left behind that video. A joke, maybe? I pulled out my phone again and quickly texted my friends, asking if any of them were responsible for this. It seemed far-fetched, but I needed an answer. The replies came in fast. Each one denied any involvement. I believed them. None of my friends would pull a prank like this. It was too invasive, too unsettling, and yet here I was, staring at proof that someone had been in my room. I felt stupid for not securing my phone. No password, no Face ID. I spent the next few minutes setting up a proper lock screen, making sure it couldn't happen again. As I ate breakfast, I scrolled through my phone, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I checked the file properties of the video, and that's when I saw something even stranger. The video hadn't been recorded on my phone. It had been airdropped to me. My mind raced. Who could have done this? Someone nearby? Someone who had been in my apartment long enough to airdrop it? I considered going to the police, but then I hesitated. What would I tell them? Nothing was stolen. I'd left the door unlocked, so there wasn't even a break-in. No security cameras and no real evidence except the video. They wouldn't be able to help, and I knew it. I tried to push it out of my mind as I finished my morning routine. I had to go to work, and life wasn't going to stop just because something creepy had happened. Still, the unease stuck with me throughout the day. I couldn't shake the feeling that this person wasn't done, that the video had been a warning or a message. But what were they trying to say? Why would anyone go through the trouble of sneaking into my apartment just to record me sleeping? The questions gnawed at me all day. I replayed the video in my head over and over. There was something so methodical about the way the intruder moved, calm like they had done this before. And that bothered me the most. They didn't seem scared or hurried. They were comfortable in my space, and that thought sent my mind into dark places. Finally, after what felt like an endless day, I returned home. The apartment was just as I'd left it. Still, I double-checked the locks and went through every room, even the closets. I half expected to find someone hiding, but no, the place was empty. As night approached, my anxiety rose. I knew I had to sleep, but the idea of lying in the same bed where that video had been filmed was terrifying. I locked the door, checked it again, and crawled into bed, trying to push the thoughts out of my head. But it was impossible to relax. I could feel every sound in the apartment, every creak of the walls, every distant noise from the street. What was the point of that video? Was it just to scare me? Were they planning something worse? I kept imagining that person standing over me again, just like in the video, but this time I wouldn't wake up. My thoughts spiraled until I couldn't tell if I was being irrational or if something was wrong. I pulled the blanket tighter, telling myself that I was safe. The door was locked this time. No one could get in. But even as I repeated that to myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been in my apartment might still be there. Back in the late 1990s, during the summertime, I would work as a camp counselor for a sleepaway camp in the Poconos. I did this for 3 summers. I would have fun with the kids and would befriend every camp counselor. Every Wednesday night, we would play Manhunt. Basically what Manhunt is when one person is designated as the hunter, while the others try to evade capture. The hunter tries to find and tag the other players, who hide and move stealthily to avoid being caught. I would love to play this game every Wednesday night. However, the last time that I ever played this game made me quit my summer job after sleepaway camp ended that summer. To start this off, the night went off as usual. At 8, we would have our evening games. Tonight was, of course, playing Manhunt. One counselor, who I will call Sean for privacy reasons, volunteered to be the hunter that night. Sean covered his eyes and counted to 30. We all ran. I ran to the woods along with a lot of others, but many of us went in different directions. I hid in my spot. As I stated before, I will continue to call people different names for privacy reasons. I saw 2 other boys, named Owen and Griffin, run in the same direction I went, but they ran much further into the woods until I could no longer see them. At that time, I thought they were going to be fine and would be caught eventually, but I couldn't be more wrong. I then moved to a different spot where it was less visible. I saw a bunch of campers and counselors being tagged out already. When we played this game, we played with a time limit. At 8:30, the loud buzzer on the intercom went off, and we all had to report back to the home area. I then got back to my spot where the game began. I waited for 3 minutes, and pretty much everyone was already back. Sean, who was IT, then asked us, "Is this everyone? Are we still missing people?" I then looked around to see everyone standing together. As I looked around, I did remember something. Those 2 boys, Owen and Griffin, who ran past me in the same direction I went, were nowhere to be seen. I told him this, and he ordered all the campers to go back to their bunk cabins, as the staff would all search for them. Half an hour passed by, and we still couldn't find them. I was getting really worried now. The camp owner, who was called to help us, told me and all the other counselors to go back to our bunks as the administration would look for them. I then walked back to my cabin. The whole night those 2 boys would be on my mind. The next morning, they were still nowhere to be seen. The police were called and they all searched the woods and tried to find any clues, but nothing came up. There was only 1 week of camp left. As the whole week went by, police would come every day to search, and there were still no leads yet on the case. After camp ended, I then decided that I would no longer come back to be a counselor at this camp every summer, because I couldn't help that I would beat myself up about how I just allowed those 2 boys to go missing and never be seen again. I would also look so ignorant and unprofessional to everyone if I continued to come back every summer. The worst part about this story is that as of today, Owen and Griffin have still not yet been found, and they are still listed as missing people. I still feel so heartbroken and guilty. I could have told them to stop in the same spot as I was in, and would stick together for the whole game. I can only imagine that they wanted that too. I have a few theories on what could have happened to them. My first theory is that they could have run so far into the woods, so far to the point where the camp isn't visible anymore, and got completely lost and that they didn't know where they were. My second theory is that they could have run far enough only to be attacked and killed by a wild animal. My third theory, which is more likely the harsh reality, is that they have been abducted. What do you think? Let me in the comment box. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. This event happened in 2004 during my senior year of high school. I attended a school called Winston Prep near Union Square in New York City. It was a special education school designed for 6th to 12th grade students, and it was different from most schools. We weren't divided by grades, but by our specific disabilities. I had been diagnosed with severe ADHD and OCD when I was younger, and the other students had similar conditions. Some had Asperger's or autism, though not the more severe forms of autism. I mostly talked to people who were more like me, those who could understand social cues a little better and acted more normal compared to the others. The setup of our school was unusual. We had the same classmates for every class, so I knew the same group of people throughout my years there. Most of my classmates were friendly. I got along with almost everyone, though there was this one guy, Quentin, who stood out strangely. I wouldn't say he was outright scary, but he was different. He didn't have many friends, and one of the things that always made me uncomfortable was the way he would just stare at people, including me. I found it unsettling, but since he didn't cause trouble for me, I didn't give it much thought. We even had conversations sometimes, and he seemed all right to talk to, or so I thought. There was one day when things started to feel odd. It was just a normal class day, and our history teacher was talking about the upcoming 2004 presidential election. George W. Bush was running for re-election against John Kerry. Our teacher went around the room asking everyone who they wanted to win. When it was Quentin's turn, he casually mentioned that he hoped Bush would win, and then he gave some reasons. But what stuck with me was his focus on gun laws. He said that he liked how Bush's party wasn't strict about guns, and that people should be allowed to protect themselves with firearms. Then, in a tone that seemed far too casual, he mentioned that he owned a BB gun and planned to bring it to school one day. We all laughed, thinking he was joking. As the days passed, Quentin's odd comment faded from memory, until something happened that none of us could have predicted. On Tuesday, I was in my second class of the day when the lockdown siren blared through the school. We were all confused. Usually, the teachers told us about lockdown drills ahead of time, but there had been no warning this time. That's when I realized this wasn't a drill. The atmosphere shifted, and my classmates grew silent and tense. 10 minutes passed, and though we couldn't see outside because the blinds were drawn, we could hear something going on in the hallways. It wasn't clear at first, but I could make out the sound of lockers slamming shut, and what sounded like people being pushed around. The stairway door banged open, and for a moment, everything went completely still. Then, just like that, the principal's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. She announced that the lockdown was over, and that school would be ending early for safety reasons. Her voice was calm, but I could sense the urgency behind her words. Everyone was on edge. We quickly gathered our things and left the school, still not sure what had happened. As soon as I was outside, I flipped open my phone. It was a clunky flip phone, not like the smartphones we have today, but it did the job. I kept it off during school, so I wouldn't get in trouble. I remember the message I received from my friend that day, as clearly as if I'd read it yesterday. "Dude, this is crazy. Quentin just got arrested for bringing a BB gun to school." I stood there stunned. The pieces started to come together in my mind. Quentin had said he'd bring a gun to school. We all thought it was a joke, but he wasn't kidding. I didn't know what he had planned to do with it, but it was clear that whatever it wasn't good. The idea that someone I had spoken to, even had casual conversations with, had brought a weapon to school, well, it was unsettling in a way I hadn't expected. I managed to finish the rest of my senior year without any further incidents, and things went back to normal. But the memory of that day has stayed with me, a strange reminder of how quickly something can turn dangerous. Now, as I look back, I realize that sometimes people's intentions aren't as innocent as they seem. Quentin had been hiding something darker beneath the surface all along. Today, I'm a middle school English teacher, helping students learn and navigate their challenges, much like I once did. I don't know what became of Quentin. I never saw him again after that day. But I can't help but wonder sometimes what path he ended up on. From what I knew of him, it doesn't seem like it would have been a good one. Still, I moved on, and I hope in some way he did too. That event, though now far behind me, changed how I look at people, especially those who seem off in subtle ways. I'm 22 now, and about to start my last year of college. Making friends has always been a struggle for me, and I never really understood why. For most people, it seems so easy to connect with others, but not for me. So when I was feeling lonely, I would turn to omi.tv, a site where you can chat with random people. The time the conversations were boring or weird. Sometimes people were friendly, but other times they were rude or just plain strange. It became part of my routine, scrolling through random faces, talking here and there, but nothing meaningful ever came from it. That all changed one night last week, when something happened that made me stop using the site forever. Most of them skipped me without saying anything, which was normal. I didn't mind. It had always been like that. But then I connected with two boys, and everything changed. There were two of them on the screen. The older one looked like he was maybe 15 or 16, and the younger one couldn't have been more than 10. As soon as they appeared, I felt like something was off. The older boy had a knife. He wasn't trying to hide it. He held it out, close to the younger boy, in a way that made me immediately uneasy. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My heart started racing, but I couldn't bring myself to disconnect. The younger boy looked scared, and his voice trembled when he spoke. "Hi," he said quietly. It was such a simple word, but it felt wrong in the situation. The older boy snapped at me, his voice harsh and demanding. "Don't leave." I was scared. Every instinct told me to leave, to shut my computer and get out of this horrible situation. But I couldn't. What if something happened to the younger boy if I left? My mind filled with horrible possibilities, and I felt trapped. I decided to stay, hoping that maybe I could calm things down somehow, even though I had no idea what to do. I tried to sound calm and said hi back, but my voice shook. The younger boy didn't tell me his name. Instead, he told me his birthday, as if that was something normal to say. It felt strange, like he was trying to break the tension by sharing something personal. I just nodded, trying to act normal, but nothing about this situation was normal. Then things took a turn for the worse. The older boy, still holding the knife, barked an order at the younger one. "Okay, now, go." At first, I didn't understand what he meant, but it became clear quickly, and in the worst way possible. The younger boy started doing something inappropriate, and the horror of the situation hit me like a wave. I couldn't believe what was happening. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. I immediately tried to end the call. My hand flew to the mouse, but it wouldn't move. The cursor was frozen on the screen, and no matter how hard I tried to click the exit button, nothing happened. I pressed the power button on my computer, but it didn't work either. Panic set in as I realized I was stuck watching this horrifying scene unfold, and I couldn't stop it. My computer was a desktop, and there wasn't a lid I could just slam shut. The power cord was tucked behind my desk, out of reach unless I moved a bunch of furniture. I was completely helpless, forced to sit there as my heart raced and my mind spiraled into panic. I didn't know what to do. After what felt like forever, the video finally ended. The screen went black, and my computer shut down on its own. I sat there in the dark, my heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened. Relief washed over me for a brief moment, but it quickly faded. I didn't know how to make sense of it. What had I just witnessed? What was I supposed to do now? The thought of reporting the incident crossed my mind, but I doubted it would do any good. and I had no way of knowing what they might do next. The younger one had seemed so scared, and I couldn't help but hope that he would realize how dangerous his older brother was. I hoped he would find a way to break free from whatever horrible situation he was trapped in. Since that night, I haven't gone back to Omi TV. Some things are just too disturbing to risk experiencing again. In 2019, I moved to New York for college. I had always dreamed of living in the city, surrounded by its bright lights and endless opportunities. I rented a small apartment on the third floor of an old building. The place was far from perfect, but it was my first home away from my family, and I liked the independence it gave me. My name is Corlin, and I have always been an independent person, but living alone in such a big city comes with its challenges. The first few months were normal. I went to my classes, made a few friends, and spent my evenings studying or watching Netflix. The neighborhood was usually quiet at night, and my building was a mix of college students and older residents. Felt safe, or at least it did. One night, after a long day at school, I sat at my desk near the window, finishing some homework. It was late, maybe around 11 p.m. My window faced the back of another apartment building, but there was an alley in between. Usually it was empty, except for some trash bins and the occasional stray cat. That night, though, something caught my eye. At first I thought I was just tired of seeing things that weren't there. But when I looked again, I saw it clearly. A figure standing in the alley, staring straight at my window. I couldn't make out his face because the light from the nearby street lamp only outlined his shadow. His figure was tall, and he wore dark clothes, blending into the night. I froze. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. My heart started beating faster, and I felt this heaviness in my chest. I stared back, hoping maybe he would go away. But he didn't. He just stood there, unmoving, like a statue. I told myself it was nothing, just some random guy passing by. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. I shut the curtains and tried to focus on my homework, but it was no use. My hands were shaking, and I felt too nervous to concentrate. I turned off my desk lamp and crawled into bed, pulling the blankets over me, trying to forget what I had seen. It took me a while to fall asleep that night, but eventually, exhaustion took over. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. The room was dark, and everything was quiet. Then I remembered the figure in the alley. My heart started racing again. I told myself it was a dream, that no one was out there. But then, out of pure paranoia, I decided to check something. A few weeks before, I had bought a small camera for my room. I wasn't paranoid, but my parents had suggested it, saying it was a good idea since I lived alone. I had it positioned on a shelf across from my bed, pointed towards the door, mostly in case someone broke in while I was out. I hadn't even thought about using it while I slept, but I had left it on that night. I reached for my phone and opened the app that connected to the camera. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the footage, skipping ahead to the time I went to sleep. Everything seemed normal, just me, lying in bed, the soft glow of the streetlights barely lighting the room through the curtains. But then, at around 3 a.m., something happened. The door to my apartment opened. I stopped breathing for a moment. I hadn't heard anything. I had locked the door before bed. I was sure of it. The camera showed the door slowly creaking open, and then a figure stepped into the room. It was the same man I had seen in the alley. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket with a hood pulled up over his head. He didn't rush inside. He walked slowly, almost deliberately, and stood near the foot of my bed. My stomach twisted as I watched the footage. There I was, asleep, completely unaware that someone was standing just feet away from me. He didn't do anything at first. He just watched me, standing perfectly still, staring at me through the darkness. I fast-forwarded the footage, my heart pounding in my chest. For at least 10 minutes, the man didn't move. He just stood there, staring. Finally, he moved closer, leaning in as if to get a better look at me. My sleeping form shifted a little, probably just moving in my sleep. He stepped back like he was afraid I would wake up. Then, as quietly as he had come, he turned and left. The door closed behind him, and that was it. He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't touched anything. He had just stood there watching. I sat in bed, staring at my phone screen, trying to process what I had just seen. My mouth was dry, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But what would I even tell them? That a man had broken into my apartment, stood there, and then left without doing anything. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept thinking about what could have happened. Why had he come into my apartment? Why didn't he take anything? What was he planning? The questions kept running through my mind, but there were no answers. The next morning, I reported the incident to the building manager and called the police. They came to my apartment, took my statement, and looked at the camera footage. They told me they would investigate, but weeks passed and nothing ever came of it. The man was never caught. I bought a new lock for my door and made sure to double-check it every night. I even started sleeping with the lights on. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, every time I look out the window, I half expect to see that figure standing there, watching me again. He never came back, but the memory of that night stays with me. The feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone had been in my apartment while I was vulnerable and asleep, haunts me every time I close my eyes. Living alone in the city wasn't the adventure I had hoped for. It was a nightmare I couldn't escape. I emigrated to New York from Bangladesh in 1968. I emigrated with my wife, my 2 sons and me, and my wife's brothers and sisters along with their kids. I started learning English when I was 3 and am now completely fluent in it. I completed my studies at the University of Dhaka and I am now retired from working. When I first came to New York, I moved to a poor part of the Bronx since we had no money. The streets were dirty, there was a lot of gang violence in the area, rats were everywhere, and we had to survive with no air conditioning. Me and my family would experience xenophobia daily, but we didn't let that get to us. We were focused on surviving and making enough money to pay the bills for our house. I ended up working 2 jobs every day, one as a taxi driver and the other one of me being a cashier at a candy shop. My wife would work as a sewer and my kids would go on to learn in school. As the years went by, it would mostly work out for us. We weren't getting paid a lot, but it was enough to pay the bills, child support, education, and groceries. As we saved all of our money, we were able to move to a more peaceful environment and a nicer and more stable house in Queens. Me and my wife still worked our jobs and my kids were doing good in school. Every day was upbeat for us, except this one day in 1980. It was around 2 or 3 p.m. At that time, I was working at the candy shop. Customers throughout the day would just buy candy and leave, but this one person had other plans. I was standing waiting for the next customer to arrive, and when that happened, I did not expect it to take a harrowing turn for the worse. When the next person walked in, this guy was wearing all black, a face mask, sunglasses, and a beanie. I immediately knew he was going to rob the store. He pulled out a gun and shouted, "Open the till now!" I was scared shitless that I couldn't move my body as I held my hands up as a way of saying, "Don't shoot me." I was trying to open the till, but for some odd reason, I could not open it. The next thing that the robber said would stay with me until I die. He said, "Fuck off, you Pocky," then he shot me. I then fell to the ground. Thank God I ducked and moved to the side a little as the bullet hit my side cheek, as he was aiming for my brain. As I was down on the ground, the robber took the till and threw it on the ground, which then caused the till to break and the money to fall out. He then placed all of the money in his black bag, then sped away in his car. After he was gone, a lot of people came rushing into the store because the gunshots were loud and they probably wanted to make sure no one would die. About 6 people came running into the store and rushed to me to make sure I was okay. I said I was fine as I couldn't speak properly due to the bullet still on my cheek and I was still bleeding. One woman told me that 911 was already called and that an ambulance would be there very shortly. Then the ambulance arrived and I was taken away to the hospital. The bullet from my cheek was not removed until I was lying down on a hospital bed. My whole family was called and they came to the hospital in no time. They were all crying hysterically because they were glad that I was still alive and that I would be okay moving on. Police came a little later and they were just asking me questions that they would usually ask while solving a case. I told them that I didn't know what the thief had looked like, as he was all covered up to protect his identity. They thanked me for my time and cooperation and told me that they would let me know if they would ever catch the guy. I was able to go home 2 days later and continue what I would do every day, which was to work. The owner and the other employees of the candy shop were nice enough to pay for my medical bill. Sadly, the identity of the robber was never found, and he was never arrested. This was upsetting to me because I could have died that day. I am just really thankful that I survived, or else I wouldn't be telling you this story. Today, my family and I are doing much better in wealth and living. I am retired along with my wife, but she is still the landlord of our house. My oldest son is a doctor, my younger son is a lawyer, and my daughter, who was born later in the United States, became a writer. If you work or ever plan on working as a cashier, I just want to tell you this. Pay attention to your surroundings. If a thief ever comes and points a gun at you and demands that they want money, just give it to them. Don't hesitate to do it, or you will be unlucky and get shot and possibly die depending on where the bullet will hit you. I was driving late at night on a quiet country road. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light on the empty stretch of highway ahead. I hadn't seen another car for what felt like hours. My fuel gauge was dangerously close to empty, the needle barely hovering above the red mark. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier. I had no idea how far it would be to the next gas station. Just as I was beginning to panic, I saw a faint light in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was an old gas station. It looked like something out of another time, small, with a single pump and a flickering neon sign that buzzed quietly in the still night air. The paint on the sign was faded, the word gas barely visible anymore. The windows of the small building behind the pump were dark, but I was too relieved to care. I had found what I needed. I pulled up next to the pump and turned off the car. The air was eerily quiet, not even the hum of insects or the rustling of leaves in the wind. The station felt like it was sitting in a bubble of silence, cut off from the rest of the world. But I was too focused on my dwindling fuel to notice much. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the pump. As I grabbed the nozzle, I noticed the pump was an old model, the kind you don't see anymore, with a rusty metal lever and numbers that clicked when you turned it on. I lifted the lever and expected to hear the familiar sound of gas flowing, but there was nothing. The pump was silent. I tapped it a few times, trying to get it to work. Still nothing. Frustrated, I looked around for some kind of help. The station seemed deserted, but there had to be someone there, right? I walked over to the small building, the wooden door creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dusty and dimly lit by a single hanging light bulb that flickered occasionally. The shelves were mostly empty, with a few old snacks and drinks that looked like they'd been sitting there for decades. There was a counter at the back of the room, and behind it, an old man sat in a worn-out chair. His eyes were half closed, and for a moment, I thought he was asleep. His clothes looked old and faded, like they hadn't been washed in years. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his hands rested heavily on the counter, as if he hadn't moved in a long time. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet space. "The pump isn't working. I need some gas." The old man didn't respond right away. He blinked slowly, his eyes dull and distant. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded once. Without a word, he reached under the counter and pulled out a small metal key. He tossed it onto the counter in front of me with a faint clatter. "Try again," he muttered, his voice low and raspy like he hadn't spoken in years. I grabbed the key and hurried back outside, relieved that I might still get gas and be on my way. I inserted the key into a small slot on the side of the pump and turned it. The pump clicked to life, and I quickly filled up my tank. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as the gas flowed, the numbers ticking up slowly on the old pump. Once my tank was full, I returned the nozzle to its holder and glanced back at the building. The light inside had gone out. I frowned, confused, but shrugged it off. It was late and I was tired. All I wanted was to get back on the road and put this strange place behind me. I got into my car and drove away, the gas station disappearing into the night behind me. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The road seemed darker, the trees taller, almost like they were closing in around me. But I pushed the thought away. I was just tired, I told myself. The next day, the strange feeling still lingered. The memory of that old gas station kept creeping back into my mind. It hadn't looked like any modern station I'd ever seen. It was too old, too out of place. The old man, with his pale skin and distant eyes, hadn't seemed right either. Something about him had made my skin crawl. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to ask a local about the gas station. I found an older man who lived nearby and told him about my experience. I expected him to nod and say something about the station being old, but still there. Instead, he looked at me like I had said something insane. "There's no gas station on that road," he said, his voice firm. "Hasn't been one for decades. That place burned down about 30 years ago. Nobody's used that road since." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "But I was just there last night," I said, my voice sounding small and unsure. "I got gas. I saw it. I talked to the old man." The old man shook his head slowly. "There's no one there," he said again, this time softer, almost like he felt sorry for me. "You must have seen something else. That gas station, it's been gone a long time." I didn't know what to say. The memory of the old station was so clear in my mind. The flickering neon sign, the dusty shelves, the old man behind the counter. But according to him, none of it had been real. That road has stayed with me ever since. I don't drive that way anymore, and I never will. Now and then I think back to that gas station, to the old man with his pale, lifeless eyes, and wonder what I saw that night. Whatever it was, I knew it wasn't normal. I used to work as an advertising executive in Baltimore when I lived in New York City, back in the 1990s. The commute was tiring, but I enjoyed my job. I would wake up around 6 in the morning, would take the 3 train to Penn Station. When I arrived there, I would usually catch a 7:15 Amtrak, and the train ride would normally be 2 hours and 15 minutes. I would do this every day without any problems. Only this one day would put a sad end to this streak. It was a Friday morning, and I hopped on a 6:15 3 train like every day. There was no issue so far. Around 6:23, we arrived at the third to last stop before entering Manhattan, and then we took off from that station about a minute later. Around 6:26 or 6:27, the train came to a complete stop. I was surprised because trains wouldn't usually stop this early in the morning, as fewer people took the train at this time. I waited for about 5 minutes before the conductor came on the speaker and said, "We're extremely sorry for the delay. There is an issue going on, and we're trying to resolve this ASAP. Thank you for your patience." I was annoyed because I didn't want to be late for work, as my boss would lose his shit if anyone was late. Time kept going by, and now I was on the train for like 40 minutes. Now I was getting concerned. What the hell could be going on out there? 20 minutes later, the conductor came on the speaker again and said, "We're all so sorry that we're being held here for this long. We're expected to be here for a while now. Thank you so much for your patience." An hour had already passed by, and everyone in the subway car started to get very anxious and grumpy. 10 minutes later, I would have the most disturbing moment of my life. Right outside of my subway car, I heard a bunch of gunshots and yelling. Someone must have had intentions of killing somebody. I was so frightened at this moment that I could only sit and wait until the train would move again. Everyone else in the car felt the same way. For the next 35 minutes, I would hear constant sirens above me. Every police department in the city had to have been called. I would also hear loud talking outside of the car. I could tell a huge crime scene was going on. Time still flew by, and I was still stuck in the tunnel. Around 8:30-ish, the train finally moved again, and everyone cheered happily so loudly. There was still no signal, as we were still underground. We then arrived at the next stop. We were all forced to exit the train, as the whole line would be shut down for the remainder of the day. I then called my boss and told him that I wouldn't be coming to work today, and explained to him what exactly had happened. He then said that it was all good and hoped that I was safe and sound. After getting off the phone, I then walked up to a police officer and asked him what happened. He told me that we could not tell anybody what the situation was and that we would have to find out in tomorrow's newspaper. I said thank you and then walked out of the station and hailed a taxi back home. The next morning, I went outside of my apartment front door to grab my newspaper. I picked it up, and what I read on the front page, I felt as if my heart went into my stomach. On Thursday night, a homeless man stole a gun from a gun shop and ran off. Nobody was able to catch him as he ran so fast. Later, he would enter a train station not too far from my station and would jump on the tracks and run away, as witnesses said. He then hid from police between multiple stops from night up until morning. It was at the station that I stopped, around the time I was on the train, that a security guard working behind the surveillance cameras spotted a homeless man on the tracks and informed the train conductor about this, which resulted in the train stopping for an estimated 2 hours and 30 minutes. During this gruesome period, the police were called and they kept searching for the man everywhere until the police and we heard gunshots from underneath the train and the cops fired back at the man. He was immediately killed after being shot. It then took a while before other police and EMTs arrived at the scene and carried the dead body of the homeless man in a body bag. About 5 years later, I quit that job because I got a higher paying job offer that was in the city, and I didn't have to commute down to Baltimore. After this scary incident, I'm extremely afraid of guns, and whenever I see one at a store or on TV, the memory keeps playing back in my head of when I heard shots fired right outside and underneath the subway car I was in.
What I'm about to tell you is one of the last memories I can still remember from middle school, and not for a good reason. I'd argue that it was the most traumatic thing that has ever happened to me. When I was in middle school, I didn't have a lot of friends. The friends I did have were all a little odd, but then again, so was I. We spent a lot of time together and enjoyed a lot of the same things. There was Greg, Jay, Mark, and myself. We were inseparable. Back then, it seemed like the four of us would last forever. Looking back though, it was pretty clear that Jay and I were beginning to distance ourselves from Mark and Greg, but that's neither here nor there. One summer, Greg invited the three of us on a week-long trip to Maine. Greg's family had a summer home up in Maine on one of the little islands in Casco Bay. To be completely honest, his family was really secretive about the place, and none of us even knew it existed until he invited us there. His family was strange in general, but that's a story for another time. The drive was long and uncomfortable. I had a runny nose and was sneezing the entire time, which I could tell was really pissing off Greg's dad. He was one of those over-the-top germaphobes, and I got really uncomfortable anytime he'd look at me. Mark and I were also bickering about something stupid, but the two of us tended to get into that a lot. We had to drive the car onto a ferry in order to make it to the island. That part was actually really fun. The house was small but pretty. I remember feeling detached from reality in that house. I can't really explain it. It was like a whole other world on that island. I still feel like it would be easy for a person to get lost in that house, if that makes any sense. The island had a really dreamy feel. Everyone knew each other, and random people on the street would recognize and say hello to Greg when they saw him. We spent most of our time biking around, an activity that never got boring at our age. I'll skip the boring stuff. I don't remember all of it anyway. The second day of the trip, I couldn't find my Barcelona snapback cap anywhere. I was really upset since I was a huge soccer fan, and it was one of the only pieces of merch I had. Greg said he thought I left it on the beach, but I was almost certain I had brought it back. I remember crying to Greg's dad, who basically told me to get over it and not let something small ruin the trip, so that's what I did. The next day, after a long day of biking around, I realized one of my pens was missing. I had a pen collection at that time, which I brought everywhere. Like I said, weird kid. I couldn't remember whether or not I had taken that specific pen out of my case, but Jay said he remembered seeing me holding it on my bike. I was devastated. To me, losing a pen was the equivalent of losing a limb. That's how serious I was about them. I refused to cry again in front of Greg's dad, so I claimed I wasn't feeling well and opted to spend the rest of the evening in bed. I ended up falling asleep really early because of that, so I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when I woke up at 3 a.m. and couldn't fall back asleep. I was rolling around trying to fall back asleep when I picked up on something. I froze for a few seconds to confirm what I was hearing. Someone was whispering, almost inaudibly. I had to focus really hard to even hear it. Was I dreaming? There was no shot. I tried as best as possible to make out what they were saying, but couldn't understand a single word. It sounded like it was coming from Mark's bed, the top bunk across the room from me, but I couldn't be certain. I waited a few minutes, but the whispering continued. For some reason, I was scared to say anything or reveal that I was awake. Eventually, I blocked the whispering out of my mind and fell asleep. The next morning, I tried to forget about what had happened the night before. I debated asking my friends which of them had been doing it, but decided against it. We were playing some dumb game in the yard when Mark said he had to use the bathroom. He was gone a while, but that was typical for Mark. He took a lot of time to do everything. Eventually, I shot a glance back at the house and had to do a double take. In one of the second-floor windows was Mark, staring blankly out at us. I figured he was in the bathroom, but that's when it hit me. Greg's house didn't have a second-floor bathroom. I turned to see if either Greg or Jay noticed, but neither of them were looking. When I turned to look back at the house, Mark was gone. Greg's dad was planning on taking us to dinner that night, but I didn't want to go. I pretended to be sick again and told him I wanted to nap instead. He said that was fine and told me he'd bring me back something. As I was lying in bed, I realized there was no way I was going to fall asleep. I started thinking things over in my head. I just couldn't get over how weird it was that Mark was watching all of us from the house, and the whispering was even creepier. I'm not sure what compelled me to do it, but I got out of bed and started snooping around Mark's bunk. My jaw basically hit the floor when I found my Barcelona cap in his duffel bag. I dug around some more and found a bunch of my personal belongings that I didn't even know were missing. There was a nail clipper my mom had packed for me in there, along with my extra toothbrush, and, most disturbingly, a pair of my underwear. I didn't know what to think. I was about to cry when I noticed something else in the bag. His notebook. Sometimes, even to this day, I still regret picking up that notebook. My middle school brain was not prepared for what was in there. It was completely filled with drawings, pencil drawings, some sketched so aggressively that there were holes in some of the pages. There were drawings of monsters, creatures, and things out of nightmares. There were really disturbing acts of violence drawn in there. People getting run over by cars, stabbed, mutilated, tortured. It was sick. Worse than sick, it was demonic. There was honest-to-God demonic shit in there. There were drawings of me in there. The image that was never and will never leave my brain is a drawing of me on a cross with my legs missing. The last few pages were basically all of me, and one of the pages was just my name, scribbled 100 times. It makes me sick thinking about everything I saw in there, and there's stuff I haven't even mentioned. The last page was the worst. My name was at the top of the page in big letters, and below it were 4 words I'll never forget. I'll do it tomorrow. When everyone got back home, I got Greg's dad alone and told him about what was going on in a low voice while my friend started a movie in the living room. He didn't believe me until I showed him Mark's notebook, which I could tell he found equally disturbing. He didn't know what to do. He told me to put everything back the way I found it. I didn't want to, but he was the adult, and I couldn't tell him no. As I was putting the notebook back, I made a split-second decision and tore one of the pages out. Meanwhile, Greg's dad then ran out to the living room and told everyone there was a family emergency and that we had to end the trip early. As we were frantically packing our things, I could feel Mark's eyes burning a hole in my back. I was scared to look at him. We pulled out of the driveway, caught the first ferry off the island, and drove the whole way back without stopping once. Greg's dad dropped Mark off first, then James. James and Greg lived on the same street, so he let Greg out of the car with James. As we were driving to my house, Greg's dad told me that he'd talked to Mark's parents, and that it was best that I not mention anything to my parents. Greg and Mark's families were really close, so I guess that made sense. When I got home, though, I couldn't last 10 minutes. I broke down crying to my parents and told them everything. They were furious and called the police in the same minute. My parents were also outraged that Greg's dad would try to sweep something so serious under the rug. Things get a little fuzzy after that. I remember crying again while telling the police what happened. When they asked for proof, I was able to show them the page I ripped out of Mark's notebook. Apparently, that was enough. The police obtained a warrant and actually found the notebook. My items were all returned except for my pen, which the police were never able to find. My parents didn't tell me much about how things went, but I never saw Mark again. His family moved, and he never showed up to school again. I never hung out with Greg again either. The reason I'm writing this now is because last week, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. It said I remember everything, and wrapped inside the envelope was the pen Mark had stolen from me all those years ago. I have no idea how he found my address or why it's taken him so long to reach out. I'm honestly considering switching apartments. If anyone has any advice about my situation, I'd greatly appreciate it. This story is fresh in my mind since it literally happened last week as I'm writing this. My extended family is odd. I won't get into it, but basically everyone is either a gun nut, avid hunter, or both. Most families go on vacation in the summer. Mine tends to go around winter time. We don't go on typical vacations though. Every season, the adults chip in and rent a house for a week in some random location, usually in the woods. This time around it was a cabin in Vermont. I say cabin, but it was more like a castle. It had to be to accommodate all of us. Now comes the strange part. We play a lot of weird games as a family. Most of them involve shooting to some capacity. Here's the weirdest one. On the second to last night, all the adults gear up in warm clothing and venture outside into the woods for a massive game of laser tag. I know how ridiculous this sounds, believe me. I'm no stranger to people walking out of my life because of my family. The winner every year gets to claim a pretty decent prize pot and a ton of bragging rights. Plus, we played with this really cool industrial-grade set my uncle Lucian made. He was the most gung-ho about this whole thing. The rules were simple. It was every man for himself, and the last person tagged won. If there were multiple people left by midnight, the prize was split. Once you got tagged, you made your way to the fire pit outside the house. Once the second to last person made it back, everyone would fire rounds into the air to let the last person left know they had won. I had just turned 18, so this was literally my first time being allowed to play. I'd be lying if I told you I wasn't psyched to play, not even for the money, but just because it seemed fun. As we were about to make our way outside, Lucian made sure we all knew how the equipment worked and where to keep our markers so the game would be fair. Then he told all of us to set a 10-minute timer on our phones so we'd know when to begin. Then, without warning, he turned and sprinted into the woods, like he was running a track race. My relatives followed suit, spreading in all directions. I noticed that most of them had run uphill, so I figured going downhill would give me a better shot at lasting longer. It was dark, but the snow on the ground made things pretty visible. I can't remember how many of us were playing, but it was a lot. At least 10 of my cousins and a couple sets of parents, including mine. Our family's pretty huge. After venturing deep into the forest, I found a little perch where I could see decently far up the hill, so I figured I'd wait there and catch my breath. I sat there for a decent while, trying to think of what to do. I figured if I kept walking adjacent to the slope, I could eventually work my way upwards and maybe flank whoever was still up there, so that's what I did. I must have walked along the slope to the left for 15 minutes straight, putting as much distance between me and the house as possible. Time really wasn't an issue, as there were still about 2 hours until midnight. I started walking up the slope. Just then, I heard a very faint crunching sound over my left shoulder, in the direction facing opposite my uncle's house. I jumped behind the nearest tree, praying whoever it was couldn't get a clean shot off. After a few seconds, I looked in the direction of the sound, but didn't see anything. And then, after straining my eyes, I saw it. A very faint, almost unnoticeable trail of footprints way off in the distance. They led to a thick tree about 15 yards behind me. There was someone standing behind that tree. I was positive of it. And then it hit me. Why hadn't they just tagged me? I was clearly out in the open, oblivious to their presence, and they were clearly trying to sneak up on me. I started running up the hill, hoping to get out of range before they could get a shot off. I was just about to continue back to the right towards the house when I noticed something. Further off to the left was another set of footprints. This one was weird though. It started from deeper in the woods, came towards me, and looped back into the forest. Had someone been outflanking even me? They would have had to walk further into the woods than I had, which I found pretty hard to believe. Before I could keep thinking, I heard something from the slope I had just run up. It sounded like a person falling into the snow. I continued running, this time back toward the house. I pulled out my phone. It was past 11. I couldn't believe an hour had already gone by. I kept running and stumbled upon a path of footprints heading towards the house. They looked fresh, so I picked up the speed, hoping to catch someone off guard. I passed a line of trees and saw my cousin Corbo walking at a steady pace, laser gun in hand. I crouched and pulled out my pistol. I nailed his marker and it started blinking. He slammed his fist against a tree before shaking his head and continuing towards the house. I grinned, thrilled to have actually gotten a kill. High on the adrenaline, I decided to hatch a plan to get the jump on the person stalking me. I sprinted ahead for another minute, then doubled back until I could safely jump behind a tree without leaving an obvious trail. It was flawless. There was no way anyone following my footprints would know I was hiding there. As I was waiting there, my marker started blinking out of nowhere. I was pissed. The beam was coming from where I had just been. It was definitely whoever was stalking me. I stood up, expecting whoever had just shot me to turn their laser off. They didn't though. The beam stayed trained on me, which actually started to get on my nerves. It felt like they were taunting me. I wanted to know who had been behind me that whole time, so I started walking in the direction of the beam. They never stopped shining their laser at me, even as I began closing in. All I could see were their hands. The rest of their body was standing behind a tree. Just then, I heard a bunch of gunshots sound off behind me, making me jump. I froze. Impossible. I must have won. Corbo must have been the final kill. But then who in the world killed me? I kept staring at the thin beam of light that was still pointing at me, and then the person holding the laser gun stepped out from behind the tree. It was a stranger. Even worse, there were two of them, standing side by side. Just then, I heard a crunch from behind me. I whipped my head around to see a man in a ski mask holding a trash bag in one hand and a knife in the other. He noticed me staring at him and started sprinting toward me. I ran, ditching my gear and screaming at the top of my lungs. I could hear all three of them chasing me, yelling things that I didn't even think were English. I zipped past the trees and ran as fast as I could through the snow, praying to God I didn't trip. They were gaining on me. I didn't want to turn around, but I knew they were right on my heels. Finally, I could see the lights of the house in the distance. I kept screaming and running, feeling my legs starting to give out. I was so close to the clearing, and that's when I saw Lucian sprinting toward me, hunting rifle in hand. He aimed above my head and fired 3 shots into the air. I heard whoever was behind me trip before running back into the woods. I collapsed at Lucian's feet, desperate for air. I literally passed out from exhaustion right there in the snow. The next morning was rough. My aunt explained that she had tripped at one point during the game and later realized she had dropped her laser gun, which explained how the guys in the woods had one. Corbo had tagged 6 of my relatives before I found him, which is why he was so upset when I got him. It turned out that he was in fact the last kill. Lucian and my dad had run out into the woods with their guns, but couldn't find a thing. They tried following the footprints, but there were so many branching paths and dead ends they eventually gave up. That whole day was a blur. The adults contacted the owners of the house, and we also reported everything to the police. The next morning, I woke up to yelling coming from downstairs. Lucian was losing it, yelling toward the woods at the top of his lungs. I ran down to find a single snowman facing the house. In its hand was the laser gun my aunt had dropped. Lucian fired a few rounds into the snowman's head before shouting some more threats and storming inside. It's only been about a week, but I'll send an update if I hear anything. When I was in college, I couldn't afford the extravagant spring break vacations to Mexico that all the Greek life people went on. Because of this, I spent my first 3 spring breaks on campus, which I actually didn't mind too much. By the time spring break rolled around my senior year though, I realized that it was basically my last chance to get the spring break experience I'd been missing out on. Mexico was still out of the question since I'd still be paying everything myself. Eventually, my girlfriend Allie found a decently priced Airbnb that sounded pretty appealing. We figured we could turn it into a couple's getaway of sorts, so we invited her best friend Laya and her boyfriend Calvin. We were all super excited since we had never been on a vacation together before. The place we had picked wasn't your typical spring break Airbnb though. It was nestled in a really secluded woodsy area in Lake County, California. There was a hot tub, an exposed fireplace, an antique-style record player, and some cots for stargazing outside. It was honestly perfect. The place was about 2.5 hours away, so we'd get a nice and relaxing drive on the way. Unfortunately, Calvin drove a really cramped Mini Cooper, meaning the girls had to squeeze into the back seat. He was honestly pretty insecure about his car and would get annoyed when one of us would make a comment about it, which was a pretty funny detail. As terrible as that car was, it was a drop top, which was really nice. We pulled in around 8 p.m. after it was already fully dark out. I can't even lie, the place looked a little scary late at night with all the lights off. When I say it was in the woods, I mean it. The trees blocked the view of all but one of the neighboring houses. The first night was really chill. We hung by the fireplace with a bottle of wine and played some board games. We wanted to go in the hot tub, but Calvin was complaining, so we didn't. He was honestly being pretty pouty for some reason, but we all just assumed there was something on his mind. The next night was better. We convinced Calvin to join us in the hot tub for some drinking games. The hot tub was connected to the back of the house, but inside its own little room, the walls of which were just screens. We were playing Never Have I Ever with some music blasting, having a lot of fun. We were all more than a little buzzed at that point. And just then, though, a flash of bright light lit up the spa room. If it had been raining, we would have assumed it was lightning. That's how bright it was. I quickly turned the music off, and the four of us stared at each other, nervous to say anything. I quietly got out of the hot tub and made my way from the spa room to the back deck. I looked out into the woods, but it was too dark to see anything. Out of nowhere, I started hearing a clicking sound coming from the woods. A few seconds later, I heard another one from a different direction, and then a whistling sound started up. The sounds kept coming, clicking and whistling from too many directions to keep track of. I yelled for Calvin and the girls to run inside, and I followed them into the house. The four of us huddled in the living room, not sure of what to do. I thought maybe it was a dumb prank or someone messing with us, which is why we didn't call the police right away. A few minutes later, though, someone started banging on the front door. The girls were hysterical, so I told Calvin to call the police while I grabbed the biggest knife in the kitchen, ready to protect everyone should it come to that. I yelled in a deep voice that I had a gun, which was obviously just a bluff. The banging stopped. Calvin said the police were on the way, but out there in the middle of nowhere, they could have been miles from us. We waited in silence for a few minutes. It was the tensest moment of my life. Just when we thought the nightmare was over, one of the living room windows shattered. Someone had thrown a massive rock through it. The girls screamed, and I told everyone to run upstairs and lock the door. I stayed downstairs, bracing myself for a fight. By some miracle, no one came charging through the window. Eventually, I ran over to inspect the window and noticed there was a piece of paper taped to the rock that had been thrown. Scribbled in black ink were the words, "Go away, you shouldn't be here." The police arrived shortly after and did a thorough search of the property. They of course found nothing. We weren't sticking around to wait for them though. We were packed up and out of there that night. The Airbnb hosts actually ended up giving us a refund, although they refused to talk about the situation. My girlfriend thinks there's something the owner wasn't telling us. Maybe she's right. I guess that could explain why the place was so cheap. Either way, I don't think I'll be taking any vacations or using Airbnb anytime soon.
My girlfriend and I love skiing. It's how we met. So last year, during both of our vacation times, we Airbnb'd a one-bedroom cabin in Colorado by Vail Mountain. One of my friends told us getting a private cabin was a lot more cozy, peaceful, and romantic. After landing at the airport, we taxied to a rental car place and rented a Honda Civic, probably the cheapest car we could get. We drove a constant uphill through the sludge on the roads until we pulled off the main road onto a more foresty side road. Eventually, we made it to the cabin. Far and isolated from anyone else, but not too far where getting to the mountain would be a pain in the ass. The owner left the key hidden in the mailbox. As soon as I unlocked the door and we stepped inside, we got a huge whiff of, wood. It literally smelled exactly how you'd expect a log cabin to smell. It wasn't huge, but it was spacious enough. One bedroom, one bathroom, decent living room with a TV, and a kitchen. I was paying chump change for it, so I was more than happy with it. Plus, we were there to ski, not sit around the cabin. We got there towards the end of the day, so we didn't hit the slopes that night. We actually just unloaded and got right back on the road to pick up a pizza for dinner. We got back and ate on the couch in the living room while watching a movie. With the dark, moody lighting and the whole log cabin atmosphere, it actually was quite romantic, until my girlfriend started freaking out about her bag. Apparently it wasn't where she left it, which was on the coffee table in the living room. I helped her look around, though there wasn't much space to search. She was absolutely positive she left it on the coffee table. It wasn't in the bathroom, kitchen, or living room, so I checked the bedroom, and sure enough, it was sitting right next to the bed. I picked it up and brought it to the doorway of the bedroom with a smirk on my face. My girlfriend didn't seem as relieved as I thought she would be, though. She accused me of moving it and going through her bag, which I found downright insane. We had a bit of an argument until I convinced her that she in fact put her bag in there and that she had just forgotten. We went back to eating and watching the movie, and we got over the argument quickly. The next day, we hit the slopes from early morning till dusk. We stopped on the way back to the cabin to get dinner again. When we returned back to the cabin, we both immediately noticed the living room light was on. My girlfriend was slightly freaking out. I told her to chill. The front door was still locked, so that confirmed nobody had broken in. I thought obviously one of us left the light on by mistake and didn't notice earlier because it was bright out. So once again, we ate our food and watched a movie, when suddenly, out of nowhere, my girlfriend shrieked. I jumped up and looked at her. She had one hand covering her mouth, the other pointing at something on the ground. At first I didn't see it, but when I got up confused and moved closer, I saw it. It was a pair of somewhat fresh boot marks in the rug in the corner of the living room. The snow from the boots had melted into wet stains in the area rug. Obviously both of us wore boots, but I just didn't remember stepping over there. My girlfriend asked me to check around the cabin to make her feel safe, so I did. I peeped under the kitchen table, behind the living room couch, in the bathroom, and I took a peep in the bedroom. There didn't appear to be anyone in the cabin. There weren't really many places to hide anyway. Still, she was scared and seemed to lose all interest in the movie. She went to the bathroom and brushed her teeth, then went to the bedroom to change, and I heard her jump into bed. So I did all the same. I climbed into bed and shut the light, and we sat there for a while just talking. It was actually only like 9 or 10 p.m. My girlfriend kept letting me know how uncomfortable she was, thinking someone was in the cabin. So I told her, okay, just wait 1 second. I took out my phone and dialed the Airbnb host. I put the phone up to my ear and heard it ring. I don't mean the ring coming from the phone speaker. I meant I heard a loud, muffled ringing coming from behind the wall next to the bed. The ringing stopped as soon as I saw my call was rejected. My girlfriend started screaming, "Oh my God." I told her to calm down as I got up and approached the wall to the left. I noticed an ever so slight crack in the wall that looked like it could be a door. My girlfriend screamed at me not to open it, but I got myself angry, yelled, and pulled open the door. There I was, faced with a small, hidden closet, and inside, a man hiding behind a cardboard box in the corner. It was the host, the owner of the cabin. I'd seen his picture on the listing. I'll admit, I jumped and screamed in fear and shock when I saw him, but anger overcame me and I grabbed him by his shirt and pulled him out. I knew he looked creepy based on his picture. He had his hands up, apologizing. I told him to shut up. I looked deeper in the closet, and to my disgust, found some of my girlfriend's underwear. It took way too long for the police to arrive, but he was arrested. We had to spend the rest of that night at a hotel, and the next day we went home. I requested compensation from Airbnb, and it took months for them to refund me, but they eventually did. This story was so bizarre and disturbing, I don't even expect everyone to believe it when I tell it, but it was oh too real. When my best friend Lizzie and I were 18, we went on our first vacation alone together to London. We were staying at the London Marriott Hotel. The first thing we did upon arrival was of course to get there and drop off all our luggage. We'd be there for a whole week, so we had to set our itinerary. It was late in the day already, so we didn't have much time that day, but we did want to see something at least, so we went to see Big Ben, which is that iconic big clock tower that everyone knows in pictures when you think of London. After that, we went to a nearby tavern for dinner called St. Stephen's Tavern. It was money, but good thing our dads were paying for this trip. After leaving the tavern, it was like 9 o'clock, and we were wanting to go out and experience the nightlife. We agreed we'd first have to go back to the hotel and shower and change first. As we were walking, a young, attractive man overheard us talking about the nearby bars we were looking at on our phones, and he stopped us. Something about him immediately was just charming that grabs both my and Lizzie's attention, and if it weren't for that, maybe we wouldn't have been so receptive to him telling us about a big apartment party that one of his rich friends was throwing that night, and that two attractive ladies like ourselves would fit right in. Lizzie and I looked at each other and laughed. We said we'd be down, and he said great, the party doesn't start till 11. He asked for my number, so I gave it to him. Then he said he'd text me the details and see us later, and down the street he walked. Lizzie and I were super excited. It was only the first night and we were already invited to a crazy London party. We figured if we played our cards right with the wealthy people at this apartment party, we would have people to hang out with the rest of the trip. We got back to the hotel, showered and changed, and we pre-gamed with a little vodka first to loosen ourselves up. I think we drank more than we should have though. I texted the guy we met, realizing we didn't even get his name. He texted back quickly with the address to the apartment, so we loudly marched into the street to wait for our Uber. It was a 15-minute Uber drive to get to the apartment, and when we got there, we couldn't believe how different the architecture of this apartment building was compared to something back home in America. I pressed the code for the apartment, and we were quickly buzzed in. We took the elevator to the 5th floor. We were excited, but nervous, not knowing what to expect. The alcohol was definitely helping, though. I knocked on the door to the apartment, but we didn't hear music inside, which was odd. We were nervous we had the wrong apartment, until the young man from earlier opened the door. He hugged us hello, and welcomed us into this dead, quiet apartment. He shut the door, and we asked, "Where is everyone?" He said, "Oh, it's still early, don't worry." We looked around the apartment, and it was not at all as big as we were expecting for an apparent rich guy. We asked where his friend who owned the apartment was. The man said he was getting things ready in his room. He told us to sit and make ourselves comfortable. I remember looking at my phone and seeing it was like 11:30. Lizzie and I sat down, and I could tell by her face she was as put off by this as I was. The man sat down on the same couch as us, next to me. He was uncomfortably close. Suddenly, another man came out from another room. He didn't say anything. He didn't smile. He just looked at us as he walked towards the door to the apartment. Then he just stood there. The man on the couch with us started asking us questions like where we were from and if it was just us two visiting here. I started feeling sick to my stomach. The man next to us got up and went to the kitchen to get us some drinks. The man by the door stood there. Lizzie was to the left of me, so she was more hidden from view. I whispered in her ear to dial 911. She did so, and I noticed her tapping on the phone multiple times, indicating to the call taker that we needed help. Lizzie then suddenly called out loudly to the man in the kitchen, "This is apartment 5C, right?" The man at the door said yes in a deep, unfriendly voice. I whispered to Lizzie again that we needed to stall, and not to drink any drinks the man gave us. As I was whispering to Lizzie, the man standing at the door called to the man in the kitchen to hurry up with the drinks, and then he came back from the kitchen with the drinks. I had to think on my feet, to stall as long as possible before drinking whatever he just set in front of us. I put on a fake and bubbly persona and said we should play Would You Rather. I know it sounds juvenile, but I had to think of a game that didn't involve drinking. The man seemed to play along with it, so me and Lizzie started coming up with Would You Rather questions. And he started coming up with some of his own, but he would often suggest we take a sip of our drinks, saying the guests would be there soon and that we needed to loosen up some more. I stalled for as long as I could, saying we already drank a lot, but we'd be down to drink more in a little bit. I remember when things were about to turn really south. The two men looked at each other. Then the bigger, scarier man at the door came over and said, "All right, drink your drinks." He was about to reach for one of the glasses to probably force in my face when there was an aggressive banging at the door, followed by a man shouting police. The younger man looked at us and asked, "Did you call the police?" I said, "No, why and when would we?" But my voice cracked as I said this, indicating I was nervous. Lizzie apparently just decided the hell with my story and screamed help. The police started to attempt to kick the door down, but the bigger man screamed, all right, and opened the door with his hands up. The two men tried playing innocent. Lizzie and I had to fabricate the story a little bit, saying the two men basically forced us into the apartment and wouldn't let us leave, and that we were pretty sure they drugged our drinks. That was enough to get the men arrested. A second police car arrived to escort us to the station for further questioning. The drinks were tested, and it turned out to no surprise they were roofied. This was definitely a scarring experience, but we didn't let it ruin our trip to London. In fact, we never told our parents until years later just because it would probably make them less likely to let us travel anymore. The alcohol definitely didn't help our initial decision-making in the night. But our advice would probably be don't ever trust strangers, no matter what they look like. When I was 14, my parents took us on a trip to a family resort. It was in the middle of nowhere, and it was the most countryish, old-style resort you could ever imagine. Every building was made of wood, there were big creepy bugs crawling around, the inside of the resort halls all smelled like cigarettes. I felt too old to be in there with my family, especially since I'm the only boy out of my siblings, and my sisters were 9 and 5 at the time. I tried looking for teens my age to make friends with, but it really seemed like it was just families with younger kids. However, I met this girl who was 15. We met in the little arcade hall when I was with my 2 sisters. She came up to me and said, "Hey." As it turned out, she was staying here with her family too, and she wasn't having a good time either. So we started to hang out. She seemed kind of cool, a little strange, had somewhat gothy vibes to her. Her name was Alyssa. The next day, I ran into her again as I was passing by the pool. She waved me over, and she said let's go for a walk in the woods by the river. As we did, I tried to get to know her more. I asked her what building her room was in. She hesitated before her answer and then said, "The one next to the main hall." It was a vague answer. We sat by the river for a while, and I gotta admit, she started talking about some weird, dark stuff. I won't get into it, but I started to think she had some issues. Then she looked up at me and said, "Can we go to your room?" I lit up with excitement inside. I was a 14-year-old boy, hormones raging, so obviously I said yes with a little too much excitement in me, imagining the best-case scenario. We got close to my room, and she asked for the card to open the door, and she ran ahead to open it. We sat on my bed for a few minutes. I was a bit awkward, so I didn't know how to make a move or if to make a move. She started talking about deep, dark stuff again though. How she hated her family, how she had no more friends, how she likes the feel of blood, whatever that meant. Then out of nowhere, she flicked open a huge switchblade and looked at me. She told me sometimes she thinks about using this on herself or someone else. That was the moment this went from weird to disturbing. This wasn't going where I thought it was. It was actually going in a much darker, scarier direction. The way she looked at me with the knife flicked open was scaring me. She looked at me and said, "Do you want to use this knife on someone here?" I thought over my answer and said, "I don't know, I have to think about it." Obviously, I would never, but this girl's true psychotic nature had just come out, and I had to play it safe. I said we should go back outside and walk around. She said okay. So we went back outside and walked around the resort grounds. I watched the way she looked at people passing by, staring them down, not caring when they would notice. Luckily, I saw my parents straight ahead, and I said, "Oh shoot, there's my parents. I should probably go hang out with them." Alyssa looked a little bit annoyed. All she said was, "Okay." I said, "See ya," and she just looked at me. I went to my family, and for the rest of the day and night, I stayed with them, hoping to not run into that freaky girl again. That night, we got back to the room around 9. This resort had huge rooms, so basically I had my own room that was attached to my parents' and sister's room, but it also had its own door into the hall. Anyway, I went to sleep, or at least tried to. Half an hour into laying in bed, I heard the beep from the door unlocking, and then the door to my room opening and closing. By the time I fully looked up, the door was shut and the light from the hall was gone. I saw someone standing in front of the door though. "Who is it?" I said. I heard a familiar girl's voice. "I want blood." I sat up and remembered I never got my key card back from Alyssa. She planned this. She approached my bed in the dark with something in her left hand because she had it lifted. She said it again. "I want blood. Will you help me, or will I get it from you?" I'm not ashamed to admit it. I screamed like a goddamn girl. She still stood there. She didn't charge at me. She didn't run at first. When my dad burst into the room, though, that's when she took off. My dad saw her, and I yelled she was about to kill me. He was about to go after her, but I screamed, "Don't, she has a knife." Everyone in the hall came out of their rooms to see what was going on. We went down to the main office to get some info on this Alyssa girl, and out of all the guests, there was no one named Alyssa. Hell, there were no girls even close to her age staying at the resort at that current time. Police were called, and like 4 cop cars showed up and searched the whole perimeter. I think like 2 or 3 cop cars stayed overnight since there were so many kids at the place. The key card lock was changed on our door for the night. A lot of families, including mine, left the next day, and we got a refund for the 2 days we cut short. This whole thing was actually insane. That girl was fucked up in the head, and it's scary knowing she was probably in the early stages of being a completely different monster.
Last year on Christmas Eve, I was working late. I'm 23, I work in New York City and commute home every day on the train. Since I'm one of the younger ones in the office, I got stuck with one of the worst shifts, so I wasn't able to get home until 5 o'clock. My family had already left a whole hour earlier to go to my cousin's house, so I had to drive alone. After having a quick snack before the half-hour drive, I got back in my car and put my cousin's address into my phone. Halfway through the drive, it started snowing. I got to my cousin's house around 6 o'clock. It was snowing heavily by this point, and I just made it in time to catch everyone starting dinner. I brought all of my gifts inside and cheerfully said hey to everyone. I stayed until around 11 o'clock. The rest of my family left a little sooner. I stayed an extra half hour or so just to hang out before leaving myself. By the time I was leaving, the ground had accumulated at least 2 feet of snow, and it wasn't even done snowing. The drive home was nightmarish. The roads were hardly even plowed, and I had to drive under 20 miles per hour on most roads. The roads were completely dead at this point though, most likely because everyone was smart enough to go home before the snow accumulated. Eventually I turned onto a main road that I'm sure would usually be bustling, but at 11:15 on Christmas Eve night, there wasn't a single car or a single light from a store. It was a ghost town. But then I did notice the flashing taillights of one car. It was parked on the side of the road, and the smoke seeping out from its exhaust with the taillights giving it a red tint. As I got closer, I realized there was somebody next to the car waving their hand in the air. I assumed something was wrong and they needed help. So, me being the good Samaritan I am, I pulled up behind the car. When I opened my door, the guy approached me immediately, barely even giving me time to step out. He was an average-sized man, probably 5'10", 180 pounds. He spoke in a very demanding voice, asking me if I know anything about fixing an engine. I told him I didn't know much about cars. The guy responded very quickly to everything I said. He told me it's fine. He went inside of his car for a second, popped open his trunk, came back out and told me to just wait by the trunk for a second. I had no idea what he wanted me to do. I was really confused. He walked over to the front of his car, and I heard him open the hood. I couldn't see anything he was doing since the trunk was blocking my view, and the loud wind of the snowstorm overpowered any small noises he might have been making. I put my hand on the back of the car and leaned my body in anticipation, when suddenly I heard 3 or 4 quick and aggressive footsteps in the snow behind me before I was pushed into the trunk. The man tried to close the trunk on me, but I kicked my feet up in resistance and held it up. I was able to overpower him and kick the trunk open completely. As I took advantage of the few seconds I had to get out of the trunk, I took out my keys. He tried to grab me now, and I dug my house key right into his neck. He fell to his knees and his scream echoed down the deserted street. I was in my car and halfway down the road before he could even get up from his knees. A little further down, I called 911 and reported the guy. I came back in 10 minutes to find blue and red lights illuminating the windows of the deserted stores. The police held him until the ambulance arrived for him. I watched the whole thing, and nothing ever felt better in my life. I got home safely half an hour later and told my family everything. I was still very shaken that Christmas, and this remains possibly the most horrific thing I've ever experienced. It was Christmas Eve, 2009. I was 18 years old, working at CVS. Unfortunately, I got stuck with a closing shift on Christmas Eve, meaning I'd be the only one there until midnight. I was considering quitting over it, but my parents weren't for that. The CVS was 5 miles from my house on a rather quiet corner on a dead-end street. During the day, it would normally be busy, at least busy enough to stay in business, but past 8 o'clock it would be uncommon to see any customers. On Christmas Eve night, I didn't expect to see a single soul past 8 o'clock. My shift started at 4, and it was surprisingly busy for the first few hours. As I expected, past 8 o'clock it really started to die down. The pharmacy closed at 10 tonight for Christmas Eve. Unfortunately, that meant I'd be alone at the register up front for 2 hours. Plus, I had a crush on the girl who was working the pharmacy, and we were talking most of the time the store was empty, so I was upset she was leaving. A whole hour went by, and I only rang up one customer. Come 11 o'clock, I was already getting excited for my shift to end. I'd been the only one in the entire building besides one customer for the past hour, and I was losing my mind. Suddenly, there was a very slight tap on the window. It didn't sound intentional though, it sounded more so like somebody's zipper accidentally scraped against the glass. I turned to look out the window and saw a man out there, heavy coat on, hood over his head, baggy jeans, and black boots. He was staring right at me. A few seconds after he realized that I noticed him, he walked over to the entrance and entered the store. He stared at me as he walked past and down one of the aisles before disappearing behind the shelves. Then, 5 minutes later, the tapping noise began. It sounded like it was coming from one of the aisles. I walked a little to the right behind the counter just to check down the aisle. Nobody was there though. The tapping was so consistent and deliberate, I knew it was the man making the noise. But where was it coming from? I didn't know, but I had a sudden urge to go to the bathroom. Only problem, I wasn't supposed to go to the bathroom when there was a customer in the store and I was alone with them. 10 minutes or so passed and I didn't see the customer, but I would occasionally hear the weird tapping noise coming from one of the aisles. It got to the point that I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out from behind the counter and called out, excuse me? I started walking around the aisles, looking for this man that walked in. He was nowhere to be seen, but every aisle I entered, I would hear noises coming from the next aisle over. I walked down the candy aisle and heard some of the sleigh bells jingling on the other side of the shelf, like someone was intentionally shaking them. I tried to peek through the tiny holes in the shelves to see if I could see him. I saw something completely unexpected and horrifying instead. I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me through the tiny holes in the shelf. The eyes moved away, and then the tall man entered the aisle I was in. He was making these weird noises like a child or someone who had just escaped a mental asylum. He started laughing and doing this weird tiptoe kind of hopping over to me. It sounds funny, but it was a straight up disturbing scene, and he was approaching so fast that I actually began to fear for my life. I started walking away from him, and he followed me everywhere in his weird hopping. I was back at the front of the store, ready to call my manager or the cops. Then I looked back at him and saw that he was frozen at the end of the first aisle, maybe 20 feet away from me. His goofy, eerily happy face turned to an aggressive, angry-looking stare of malice. I was officially done with this and walked out the front door, and to my horror, the man started charging at me. No more goofy hopping around, he was sprinting at me. I ran outside the store, too afraid to go to my car, because I feared he'd get me before I could lock the door. I ran around back and entered through the back door, which was still unlocked. I didn't know if he was still on my tail or not. I locked the door and hurried to the front of the store, where I locked the front door too. That was when I picked up the phone on the counter and called my manager, who was luckily still awake. I told him I had to leave immediately because somebody crazy was following me. Then I thought I heard something over my conversation. It was coming from inside the store. I put the phone down and realized it was the tapping again, coming from one of the aisles. I was out of that store and in my car within 20 seconds. I never came back. I called my manager when I got back home, and he called the cops. Surprisingly, nothing was stolen, or so I heard from a friend. My manager obviously wasn't too fond of me for leaving his store like that, so I never spoke to him again. I had as normal of a Christmas as possible, given what happened the day before.
I'm sure by now we all know what Fortnite is. I had known about it for the longest time, but I never actually played it until my friends basically forced me to download it and play with them. They wanted to play in squads, which is what it's called when you play in groups of 4. My 4 friends were Evan, Xavier, and Braxton. Evan was hands down the best player and basically the initiator of this group match. Xavier was the second best, then there was Braxton. Braxton only spoke on his headset when he was in trouble or needed help. Evan, Xavier, and I, on the other hand, just goofed around and talked the whole time. The two of them did their best to explain how to play to me over the headset. Anyway, none of this really matters. I'll skip ahead to the important part. Evan stopped talking, and there was a good 10 seconds of silence. Then, Evan, who was leading us from one point to another, stopped dead in his tracks. His character just stood still for a while. Xavier turned on his headset, sounding annoyed, telling Evan to move. His character still just stood in place, and Evan said nothing, but according to the screen, Evan's mic was making noise. Then I could hear background noise that seemed to be coming from Evan's mic. Xavier, Braxton, and I were all telling Evan to move or we'd ditch him. But we all dropped silent when a horrific, almost painfully loud screaming came from Evan's mic. It wasn't like he was screaming into the mic, it seemed like Evan was somewhere in the background of the room. Then, a door slammed shut in the background, and the 3 of us were left not knowing what to say or do. I told the 2 of them I'd call Evan immediately, and turned off the console. I tried calling him 5 times, he never picked up though, so I decided to drive over to his house, which was 2 minutes away. I got to his house and saw no cars in the driveway, but the front door was open and the lights were on throughout the house. I let myself in, screaming Evan's name. Evan screamed back from somewhere upstairs. I followed the sound of his voice right up to the loft bedroom, where I found him hiding under the bed. He told me to hide. I told him to get out from under the bed and tell me what happened. He said there was someone in his bedroom. He would speak in very limited sentences for the longest time, until he calmed down and would finally explain in detail. As Evan was playing Fortnite with us, he felt a tap under his bed. He pulled the cloth material that covered the sides of the bed up and looked under the bed, and saw a grown man hiding underneath. That's when he threw his headset on the bed and screamed as he backed into the corner. He says the man emerged from under the bed as Evan was still paralyzed in fear in the corner, screaming. Then the man walked straight out the bedroom door, and that was the last we ever saw of him. At that moment, he didn't know if the man was still in the house or not, so he called the cops, not knowing what else to do. When they showed up, we didn't know what to expect from them. 2 cops actually showed up. The male officer went inside of the house and looked around, while the female officer stayed with us outside with a small pocket notebook in her hand, writing down what Evan described to her. And just like that, the cops left. I stayed over Evan's house that night just to make him feel better. We all still play Fortnite together. I'm much better now. I've never been a huge Fortnite person, but all my friends have been for a while. I always feel like I'm being left out when they're saying to jump on Fortnite and such. Yeah, I've played the game a few times and I get the gist of the gameplay and whatnot. I'm just not good at the game. So one Monday night, I hopped on the game and played alone just to practice. I did that over and over and over, until I started actually getting pretty decent at the game. Then I started to play the game with other players, not my friends, just random people online. I played a game of duos, meaning with one other person on my team. His gamer tag was BobRocket16 or something like that, with a few extra C's and E's or whatever. I didn't write it down. We lost the game, think we ranked like number 20. After the game was over, I got a personal message from the guy, saying he thought I was really good and that we should play again. It was weird because really I didn't play too well at all that game. Nevertheless, I played another game with him. This time he turned on his microphone and was trying to talk to me. I don't have a gaming microphone, so I couldn't talk back. I could only hear him through the TV speakers. Based on his tone and what he was saying, he seemed to be getting annoyed that I wasn't talking to him. I heard him say things like "put your mic on" and "stop being a faggot." Any thought of this guy being cool was gone at this point, and I thought he was just a straight up douche. I was gonna finish the game, but after that was it with this guy. He kept saying stuff, most of it incoherent simply because of my distance to the TV and the noise of the actual game itself. But then I heard him say my name. Not just my first name, my full name. When I heard this, I panicked and thought to myself, wait, is my real name displayed on my profile? But I realized, no, it couldn't be. The guy kept saying things over the mic, but I wasn't listening at this point. I went over to the console and turned it off in a panic. Just knowing that the sound of the guy's voice was gone now made me sigh in relief. I texted my friends and told them about it. They all seemed to think it was funny, typing their LOLs and LMAOs and whatnot. I put my phone down on the desk as I went on my laptop. The phone vibrated again. I expected it to be one of my friends, but it was an unknown number. The message was hi, and then my full name. I typed back, "Who is this?" The typing bubbles with the 3 dots came up for the longest time. I waited anxiously to see what this person was going to say. The message was, "Is this your address?" and then my actual address. I once again typed, "Who is this?" and then I lied and typed, "No, that isn't my address." The person never responded after that. I started accusing my friends of fucking with me. They all swore they had nothing to do with it though. Low-key, I didn't believe them, but I didn't bother feeding into it. I figured if it is them, the more reaction I give, the more kicks they get out of it. I went to bed ignoring my friends. I woke up to something. I was almost positive I heard a noise. You know how sometimes a sound will wake you up, but you don't know what the sound was because you weren't awake yet to hear it? Well, that was me at this moment. I sat up looking around my room as anyone naturally would. My whole body jerked in startlement as there was a set of knocks on my window. Instead of looking to see who was out there like a man, I ran like a coward out of my room and to the nearest bathroom where I locked myself in.
There were no windows in that bathroom, so I felt safe. I actually fell asleep in that bathroom, and when I woke up, I texted my friends again, telling them all to go fuck themselves. They all got a kick out of it, but when I saw them in person, they seemed pretty genuine when they told me they had nothing to do with it. To this day, I really don't know if my friends were pranking me, or if that guy who I was playing Fortnite with actually somehow got my information and came to my house. My 10-year-old son Chris had been playing that Fortnite game all day every day for the past few months, and it had been driving me insane. I would scream at him to go out once in a while. Instead, all I heard was that sound of that bus honking its horn every 10 minutes and constant gunshots coming from his room. Eventually one night at like 9 p.m., Chris came out of his room and shouted out to the kitchen that he was having someone over. I angrily asked him who. He said, "Some guy from Fortnite who lives around here." A fuse went off in my head as I heard this. Apparently he invited over some random person he was talking to on Fortnite. When I asked him how old, Chris shrugged his shoulders and said, "I don't know, he sounds kinda old." I started to freak out, knowing some random stranger who was probably well older than my 10-year-old son was coming to my house. I locked all the doors and turned on all the porch lights. I told Chris to just keep playing his game in his room and not to talk to anyone else. I waited around by the windows until a car pulled up in front of my house. It stopped and the headlights turned off. The door opened, someone came out and started walking up the pathway to my front door. I felt like my heart dropped into my stomach when I saw some middle-aged man, probably 40, mildly overweight, step into the light and then up the stairs to the front door. He rang the bell 3 times. I ignored it. Then he started pounding on the door for a bit. I ignored that as well. He walked down the stoop, looking up through the windows as he walked down the pathway. I made sure he couldn't see me. I thought for sure he'd go to his car and leave, but he went around to the side of my house, out of sight from the windows. He was actually going to my back door. I heard from around back the door being nudged, as he clearly tried to open it. I stayed put where I was. There were no other entry points to the house, so once he gave up, he would surely leave. When the noises from the back door stopped, I waited for 5 minutes in the kitchen, until I thought it was time to check. I wanted to hopefully get a look outside, so I shut the lights and lifted the blinds in the kitchen. There was the man's face, 2 inches from the glass, as he looked into the kitchen, or rather, he now looked at me. I screamed with a shake in my yell that I was calling the cops. I think that scared him off because he walked away, and I watched as he got in his car and left. I didn't call the cops though. Instead, I marched right to Chris's room and scolded him. I grounded him for 2 weeks for endangering not only the household, but himself. That meant no video games for 2 weeks, and after the 2 weeks, he would have to go 2 months without access to his wireless headset. Now that the 2 weeks are up, he's back on the game. I get sick to my stomach thinking about what would have happened if I wasn't home.